Hello, welcome to day 3 of the Corporate Counsel Institute CLE. We are in the home stretch today. By way of a couple of announcements, one, we will follow the same pattern as yesterday and the day before. We'll have a session from noon to 2, take a break, then have a session from 3 to 5. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature of Zoom. It's down below. You should be able to see it. And with that, I will kick to the first panel, and I'll kick to Thurbert to lead us off. Thurbert?
Well, thank you, Sterling. And let me extend my welcome. It is Friday, so everyone should be having a great day, especially if you've been doing 3 days of panel. But we want to welcome all of you to what we believe will certainly be an informative and we hope for a very exciting panel discussion from a very, very distinguished group here. As you all know, we've got 1 hour to engage with you. That's not a long time when you're having fun, but we're going to try to stay within that 1 hour framework, or Sterling may kick us off of this panel. So we're going to try to stay within the time frame. We've got a lot to cover, but let me do this. This panel is all about regulation under the Biden administration. A lot to talk about, but we've got a great group of folks to talk about it today. And I want to just take a minute to introduce our panelists for you. You probably know a lot more about them from their bios, but let me just take a brief minute to do that. First of all, I'm Thurbert Baker, a partner here at the Denton's law firm. I'm in the public policy practice, and I served 3 terms as the state attorney general here in Georgia. Great time in the legislative arena, got a chance to meet a bunch of nice folks, but none more distinguished than the ones we have on this panel today. Let me start by introducing the senior most person, and I say all the time, he outranks us all, Governor Howard Dean. Governor Howard Dean is a senior advisor in the public policy practice here at the Denton's law firm. And many of you probably know Governor Dean because he spent 12 years as the governor of Vermont. What an accomplishment that was. But he also served as chair of the Democratic National Committee from 2005 to 2009. And he was a candidate for president in 2003. I think sometimes, Governor Dean, we forget you are a practicing physician. And so you know a lot about the medical side of the world. We always like to acknowledge that, but he is one of the most respected voices on both sides of the aisle. And so, Governor Dean, we're glad to have you on the panel this afternoon. Next, I'd like to just mention John Russell, who's chairing our advocacy practice here at the Denton's law firm. John is a principal at the firm. He's in our Washington, D.C. office. And I always like to say, hang around with very notable people. John has been voted one of the top lobbyists in Washington, D.C. for 3 years running now, John. So we just like to hang around with you because everybody knows you. But what an accomplishment that has been. 3 years in the running, voted as top lobbyist in Washington, D.C. By the Hill newspaper. John is a trusted advisor to members of Congress, so we are just excited to have him here with us. Caesar Mitchell is famous, I think, certainly here in the Atlanta, Georgia region, but probably around the country. Caesar Mitchell served for 8 years as a member of the Atlanta City Council, and if that wasn't enough, served as a term as president of the Atlanta City Council. He has been a candidate for mayor in this city. He's a partner here at Denton's now in our public policy practice. And more importantly, he heads the firm's local government solutions practice, given his deep knowledge of local government and how it interacts. Caesar, we're excited to have you on the panel as well. Andrew Shaw, thank you so much for joining us. I love Andrew because he and I spent some time at EPA many, many years ago. And Andrew has his roots in the Environmental Protection Agency, but Andrew is a partner also in our DC office for Dentons. He's a member of our public policy practice, and he has a primary focus on energy and environmental issues, a deep, deep knowledge of Congress and the executive branch. And Andrew brings a wealth of knowledge to our discussion today. So with those introductions, a very distinguished panel, why don't we get it kicked off? And for those who are viewing today, we're going to try to reserve questions for the Q&A for the last 10 minutes of this session. So if you can be patient with us and talk to us through the chat box, we'll try to pick up those questions and respond to them appropriately. So why don't we get started here? And I want to turn this over to Governor Dean, if you don't mind kicking us off with maybe a high-level discussion and overview regarding the Biden administration, their goals, their expectations, and their focus. I don't know anyone would have a better overview than you, Governor Dean. So why don't you get us kicked off in that regard?
Well, General, thank you so much for your kind introduction, although I blanched a little when you called me the senior member, because I think I'm the only member in my 70s. So I'm going to start off by saying something. I'm going to say it again at the end because it's very, very important. Lobbying to affect congressional votes is what people write about in the newspapers. It gets lots of attention, and John, of course, is being one of the top lobbyists. But lobbying is much more than that. And lobbying without dealing with the rules process is almost a waste of money. You can get 3 lines in a bill, and that helps our clients. But the truth is, you can undo those 3 lines by the rulemaking process. And I think, and rulemaking is much tougher in the sense that it's very much behind the scenes. It's almost never written about. And when it is written about, it's an incredibly boring subject for most readers, but it is how bills either get enforced or do not get enforced. And some of the remarks I'm going to make about what the Biden administration is doing has to do with not doing some things that the Congress wanted them to do. And it has to do with doing some things that the Congress either wouldn't pass or would rather they not do. So if good lobbying in the Congress and successful legislative lobbying is not followed up by really competent legal minds in looking at the rules process, then it's not that effective. And I'm going to say that again at the end. There is something, and again, before I get into specific parts about this, the comment period is the part of the lobbying process which is absolutely fascinating. It often leads to court hearings, which often leads to extensions of the comment period. These rules that have to be followed to the T, because if they're not, they're always going to be challenged in court, and sometimes that delays, because a lot of the rulemaking process and dealing in the rulemaking process is about delaying what the Congress did want to do or what they didn't want to do. Three words, we talked about 3 words in a bill can change the meaning of the bill. 3 words in a rule can undo those changes, and 3 words in a rule can change the meaning of what was intended by the Congress. Let me just cover a couple of short things, but there are many, many others, and others on this panel have specific subject expertise that I think will probably want to mention. I'm going to mention them broadly. The first and probably most far-reaching is what happens to EPA rules. EPA rules are often the most controversial things that we do or that anybody does. Environmental protection is extremely important. There are wide differences of opinion, not just between the parties, but between various geographic areas about what's good environmental practice and when too much environmental regulation may strangle business or business may strangle environmental protection. So a lot of the work that gets done is in front of the EPA, and it's very handy to have people who know the technicalities, because the technicalities matter enormously in this process. An example, which is not directly does not directly have to do with the EPA, but it certainly does with the environment, is that when President Trump was in power, we went through a shrinking of 2 very large national monuments, which were particularly important to indigenous people in the United States, but they were important for the tourist industry as well in Utah. President Biden has undone those and is now in the process, again, through the rulemaking process, of expanding those. The rule I use, technically it's not the rulemaking process. This can be done by presidential decree, but that too is subjected to a rulemaking process. Immigration is another issue. President Trump had one attitude towards how immigration was going to be controlled. President Biden is changing as he speaks through proclamation and rulemaking. The rulemaking takes a longer time than the proclamation, but the proclamations often get overturned in court, as some of President Biden's proclamations have been overturned in court. Ultimately, immigration hasn't really been changed very much since Ronald Reagan's major immigration bill. And most of the stuff since that time has been nibbling around the edges. What is an H-1B visa? Length, appropriate length, what actually has to be done to get one. Most of that stuff is in rulemaking, and because Congress hasn't really dealt with immigration for a very long time. A very obvious example, which is in the headlines all the time because it's very controversial, is mandatory vaccines. The president wants corporations over 100 to mandate vaccines for all its employees. That's now in court. So rulemaking often gets not just delayed in rulemaking, but it also goes back to court when one of the parties that's involved, or more of the parties that are involved in the process, don't like the outcome. And finally, a really interesting one is, and to me anyway, as a physician, is there's now rulemaking going on to ban menthol cigarettes. And this in some ways comes out of some of the rulemaking that is around Juul and other companies like that, and vaping and so forth, which turned out to have very unintended consequences. When vaping first started, I thought it was a terrific way to stop smoking. Well, it turned out it addicted a whole generation of teenagers. So that's going to be very controversial. Getting anything controversial through a very bitterly divided House and Senate is incredibly difficult. So what's the resort? Rulemaking. So with that, I'm going to stop with that broad sort of brush approach and just repeat myself. Lobbying to affect congressional votes is very important, but if it's not followed up by really competent legal minds in the rulemaking process, then it's not terribly effective.
Thank you, Governor Dean. You know, John, the Office of Information and Regulatory Actions has released its semi-annual unified agenda, which covers a lot. How about digging a little bit into that and telling us that shares with us about the regulatory plans under the Biden administration? Maybe we'll go to the next slide.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And we can kind of bounce through both of these, General, the next two slides. First of all, it's very nice to be with you all this afternoon. I trust everyone is safe and well and staying that way. I want to be very clear, lobbying isn't brain surgery. That's why I can do it. And there's lots of telegraphing going on as to what in fact is going to happen. Yes, tea leaves and the rest, but you know what? When you put out, as you mentioned, when you put out the unified agenda of regulatory and deregulatory actions, you got a good sense as to what's going to be taking up the administration's time over the next, let's say, 6 to, in some cases, 18 months. I want to follow up on something that Governor Dean mentioned, though, towards the end of his comments, and that was bitterly divided Congress, tough to get things done. How do you as an executive get things done? Well, you know what? You start making some rules and you take it out of the legislative process. You start doing your own things. Certainly, we saw that in the past and previous administration. And this is just a continuation. But when I made it a little bit of a joke, but it's not really a joke, it's 100% true, lobbying is not brain surgery. This is where we go. And we do it about twice a year. It's supposed to be in the fall and the spring. And just like everything in Washington, things take a little bit longer. So this was a little bit delayed in coming out. But if you're looking at it, this one, the spring agenda, which came out in June, has almost 4,000 regulatory actions. Those are 4,000 separate pieces of of regulation or movements that either suspend regulation, end regulation, or begin to consider new regulations. There's a little caveat. I don't want to say a caveat, but there's all regulations are created equal. Some are more equal than others. The more equal than others ones are these 298 that are considered economically significant. That means that they're going to cost about $100 million. That's the threshold. Those types of regulations clearly get significant attention. They get attention in the House, they get attention in the Senate, and they get a lot of media attention because those are big guys. But you know what? All right, so of the 4,000, roughly 300 were $100 million or above. That means there's a lot going on under the surface. And if you think about it, this is an opportunity for the administration to move quickly without Congress to undo things. And that's what they're doing. We got about 35%, as the slide in front of us shows, of these close, roughly 4,000 new regulations that are actually repealing what the Trump administration did. That is not unheard of, right? This is in fact how the game is played. And you know what? You actually spend some time during the transition and working with the transition team specifically to identify regulations that you would like to see the new incoming administration repeal. I would argue, and having been around some transition teams, as I know members of this panel have as well, there were a lot more than 35% of 272 actions that they wanted, or withdrawals that they wanted to complete.
Hey, John, John, make sure you're advancing the screen. Are you advancing the slides? Let's see.
Yeah, there we go. Sorry, I apologize.
No.
So this is, a quick little overview of what President Biden and how he matches up with economically significant rulemaking. I think it's important to look at these other administrations in context. Certainly, you see the Clinton administration, after 12 years of Republican rule, came in and moved some things quickly. I'd argue that after 8 years of a Democratic rule, George Bush tries to do something differently. I think President Obama actually gets tripped up here a bit because recall what he was dealing with as he came into the White House with the Great Recession. He was focused truly on other things. President Trump, well, okay, we can argue back and forth as to what that is and why that is. And then you've got President Biden kind of picking up the steam and being aggressive here. I think it's important to remember that the administration understands that Congress is very, very closely divided. They're not going to get easy wins, and this is the best way to do it. Back to you, General.
Thanks, John. And it seems I want to just pick up on a theme here. I've been told, as long as I've been in politics, that if you want to figure out where policy is going or administrations are going, you follow the money. And so what are you seeing, if looking at the slides here, and certainly from your vast experience, what can you tell from economically significant actions that are being taken by the Biden administration that would give us some glimpse of where they are going and what they intend to do? Speak to that for us.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Thurber. I think it's really important to note, and John touched on this in terms of economically significant actions. And economically significant action is one that has an impact of over $100+ million, candidly, on the budget, but also has an impact on very critical areas of the economy, whether it's public safety and health, whether it's job creation. Also, it depends on whether or not it's having an impact on the local level. And as we all know from our experience over the last 2 years, many of these regulations are still very much focused, if you look at the slide related to economically significant actions by agencies, on the Department of Health and Human Services. And we know that is an outgrowth of what we're dealing with respect to COVID-19. And so as we continue to work through that very pressing and real issue, I think you'll see a number of regulations and rules that are put in place that will tend to address and or advance President Biden's agenda as it relates to COVID-19, and really continue to triage it and really predict the future and put resources in place to ensure that we can have an appropriate response, both domestically and candidly to whatever degree the Biden administration chooses internationally as we participate and help and react to other things around the globe related to this pandemic. And not just this pandemic, but being prepared for future pandemics. But also it's important to note that economically significant rules tend to point to or point back at many of the promises that a candidate makes when they're running for president. And many of the initiatives that they espouse to be very concerned about and certainly will have committed to advance. And so in this case, you know that a significant emphasis of the Biden administration has been the infrastructure work and the Build Back America Better plan. And so you'll see a number of initiatives that will tend to support that, whether it's supporting the rules within the Department of Agriculture, certainly supporting Treasury rules. As you see, that's the second highest number of economically significant actions that will tend to facilitate funding and other types of economic activity in the economy to advance the Build Back Better plan or the infrastructure work that's on the table. You also see a significant number of plans related to, or at least significant actions related to the Department of Education. You see actions related to the Department of Labor. And when you think about the Department of Labor, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the future, in order to implement any sort of major initiative like infrastructure work, you've got to make sure that the Department of Treasury and the Department of Labor are working very, very closely together, as this will have a significant impact on jobs. The same is the case for the the Environmental Protection Agency, because many of the initiatives in the Build Back Better plan will certainly have an impact on the EPA, as certainly in our environmental policy and environmental conditions in our country, as Governor Dean alluded. Again, it is anticipated, if you think back on many of the promises made by then or previously candidate Biden, now President Biden, if you think back on many of the promises, it's really about providing not just greater job activity, but greater opportunity for small businesses. And so you see a number of economically significant actions that are impacting that particular agency. And so I think when you think about this from a larger picture, you have, of course, as John alluded, a lot of the economically significant actions really impacted by the pendulum of politics, which we've seen, you see in the slides as it relates to the number of economically significant actions that come as an administration changes, but really as an administration changes from one political party to the next. And then again, of course, economically significant actions are in many ways influenced by the promises that a particular administration makes at the outset or even during the campaign to the American people. And so you will see some action that can be done through rulemaking that can't necessarily be done as quickly or as effectively through the legislative policy. And then, of course, with COVID-19 and the pandemic being a prime example, many economically significant actions are driven by the pressing issues of the day. And some people may say the red meat issues of the day, which is in some ways true, but certainly by the pressing and real issues of the day that have to be triaged immediately.
Gentlemen, before we continue on, it seems we're not getting the slides advanced. I'm wondering, because they're advancing here on my screen, I'm wondering if our tech guys can help us figure out what's going on. We got a lot in the Q&As saying they're not seeing slides.
Okay, let's try closing out of it and stopping your screen share.
Okay.
And then close out your presentation and open it up again, and let's try screen sharing again.
Very good. We apologize for the technical difficulties. We've only been doing this for what, 20 months now? We think we should have figured it out, but
Yeah.
When in doubt, the other rule that lobbying isn't brain surgery. When in doubt, always blame the lobbyist.
Okay,
All
now
right.
let's start the slideshow from the beginning.
Yeah, I'm trying to get up to that tab. There we go.
And maybe drop those other documents too, John, from your screen.
Yeah.
Document recovery.
Yeah, we'll get rid of all that stuff.
And then maybe you can even just click on the slides on the side.
Yeah, let's see. Are folks seeing this slide? First one to respond in the Q&A gets an ice cream.
Well, we see the CLE regulatory update. That's the first slide. That's what
Yeah,
we're.
that it should be. I apologize. I'm not quite sure what's happening because we are further past that.
Can you click on the slide on the left-hand side?
Click on the second slide, John.
Yeah, I apologize, guys. I'm already on the thing. So, all right, hold on.
And when you do it, click on your actual document.
Yeah.
These are while John is trying to advance the slides. Let me follow back up on something you were just discussing, and you were talking about economically significant actions by agencies, and I noticed that the agencies that are getting the most activity seem to be all domestic related agencies versus, say, for example, defense, which may have a more international flavor. I'm wondering, and then I see HHS getting the brunt of activity. What is that telling you as you look at it from that perspective? I know my good friend Javier Becerra is now, former AG of California, is now heading HHS. So I'm just wondering what kind of attention these agencies are getting, domestic versus international. What does that suggest to you here?
Got it. And I certainly would love for Andrew and John to follow on my broad observation. But when you think about the Department of Defense, I would hate to say it's almost a country in and of itself. And so many of its actions may be known and unknown, candidly, to the American people. And so you may not see a lot of economically significant actions coming out of the Department of Defense, because remember, you know, the DOD is kind of his own animal. And then again, it goes back to those buckets of change, the pendulum buckets I mentioned, in terms of an administration being very responsive to the promises they made, which in many cases, Biden had a very, very robust domestic agenda, and certainly wanting to deal with and triage specific issues that are very real, with COVID-19 and infrastructure being two good examples. But I'll defer to John and Andrew to give their reflection.
Yeah, I was going to roll over to Andrew here, if you don't mind, Andrew, because I know there seems to have been a lot of focus on education and immigration and the environment. If you can take a look at that slide. And I just wanted to get your read on, you know, kind of what that means and what that's telling us and kind of what you're picking up and hearing in the halls of Congress.
Yeah. Well, thanks, General, and thanks to my colleagues, and thanks for everyone on the Zoom. We know it's Friday, and we appreciate folks tuning in. I think when it comes to immigration, education, and energy and the environmental issues, you know, those are real priority areas for this administration, this president, and to underscore what the governor, John, and Caesar have said. Regulations are either a complement or can be in lieu of actual legislative progress on these issues. And these three issues have proven, I think, in general, to be tough for both not just this administration, but others in being able to move forward with durable legislative solutions. In fact, with the exception of the passage of the Toxic Control Substance Act overhaul about 5 years ago, there's been no major environmental legislation that's been passed really since the 1990s. And if you go back, most of the major environmental laws have not been updated. But I think it again reflects that regulation is a way that the administration, with a lot of challenges, can be able to move their priorities. And you've seen that in the education round. I think folks may recall that President Biden, then as candidate Biden, promised $10,000 per person in student debt relief. He was, I think, arguably pushed a little bit more aggressively on that issue by his other rivals in the Democratic primary who had more robust proposals. But nonetheless, with it being hard to achieve student debt relief through the legislative process with Democrats' narrow majorities in both chambers, we've seen a slew of regulations that take kind of a piecemeal approach to mitigating some of the astronomical levels of student debt that many have to deal with. In particular, you're seeing this administration go after, in some folks' views, the for-profit college industry. On this slide, you see a reference to the rule on the gainful employment that is looking at limiting student aid to institutions that charge large fees in relation to that person's income levels. The Obama era rule had promulgated a rule that limited student aid in certain cases to such for-profit organizations. The Trump Department of Education had a very different philosophy, and you had Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, who was an advocate of for-profit entities, and undid that rule. Now you see the Biden administration going in a different direction. In this interim, while the administration is trying to get that rule and others in place, you see this challenge of this kind of regulatory limbo. The administration hasn't finished a new gainful employment rule. And so right now the Trump rule remains in place, even though the Biden administration is opposed and trying to replace that rule. And you see that in a whole host of different areas as well. There are some other actions too in the education area. You see some changes to the public service loan forgiveness program, expanding the reach of the federal government being able to forgive loans for those individuals that serve 10 years or more in public service, expanding the loan payments to different like the Perkins loans and others. In the immigration front, again, kind of durable legislative change has been clearly elusive, and it's elusive in this current environment where the Democrats' principal path to enacting sweeping changes through the reconciliation package, and that limits the types of things, including related to immigration, that they can move. Consequently, you've seen the administration earlier this fall put out a draft rule that would promulgate regulations establishing the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program that I think some folks may recall was first established by the Obama administration by executive order in President Obama's second term. You've seen both in how the previous administration and the Trump administration, the Obama administration, they've run into problems with DACA, both establishing it and setting it up, related to the Administrative Procedures Act, which requires public comment, public notice, and therefore you see the administration taking a slightly different approach in going through this notice and comment process, not using a executive order, but instead trying to establish DACA through the rulemaking process. Moving on to the environmental side, there's a lot to talk about here. It's, as as the general said at the outset, it's an area that I spend a lot of my time. I think broadly speaking, there are three areas where the administration is trying to focus their energy and environmental rulemaking. One is the National Environmental Policy Act, which requires the federal government for any major federal action to consider the environmental impacts of that said action. It's a process, not a result statute, i.e. it doesn't mandate that any federal agency take a specific action, but it does require that they look at the impacts of environmental federal actions, the environmental impacts. And what you see under this administration is a regulation that's pending that would require a consideration of cumulative environmental impacts. And that's more or less a word for climate change, both indirect and direct impacts of climate change that federal agencies need to assess when doing any major federal actions. And NEPA is going to have a lot of impact as the administration goes forward in implementing the infrastructure bill. Kind of the second big overarching area is environmental justice. With the focus on racial equity issues, environmental justice is getting a lot of attention as it should. This administration has set up 2 new task force on environmental justice and is requiring that federal agencies broaden the scope of reviews when doing rulemaking to assess the environmental justice impacts related to any rulemaking. And then lastly, kind of the major overarching issue as I see it is scientific integrity. I think there was a perceived concerns that that scientific voices were stifled in the previous administration. This current administration has taken steps to, in their estimation, solidify agencies' ability to have independent scientific processes and have those processes inform rulemaking. Just getting to a couple examples in the energy and environmental space. Obviously, there's a lot of impact and a lot of attention on climate change. We'll see some stuff in the reconciliation bill, but EPA has and will continue to be a real focus. What you see with respect to regulations for CO2 emissions from existing power plants is a recognition by the EPA that they're going to have to do things differently, at least in this instance and in other rulemakings than what the Obama administration did. The current EPA is, instead of looking at a more amorphous, what they call beyond the fence line approach to regulating emissions from power plants, i.e. trying to regulate emissions kind of electricity system wide. They're looking at more plant specific regulations. And I think that's a recognition that you have a much more, for better or worse, a much more conservative federal judiciary. The Supreme Court has already cast some concern about some of the Obama era interpretations of the EPA's authority under the Clean Air Act. And I think you see the agency responding under the Biden administration by trying to find solutions to environmental issues that will pass muster with this current Supreme Court and also with the federal judiciary. Just one other example, and I'll turn it back to the group. The governor mentioned in his opening remarks that a lot of what the regulatory process is very detailed, very specific, very technical, and I think that's completely true. One of the major rulemakings that you see at the EPA is a justification for a mercury rule that was promulgated during the Obama administration. The Trump administration repealed that justification, although they didn't undo the existing regulation. But what that justification does is deal with co-benefits. And in regulation terms, that allows if a Democratic administration, when they're doing the cost benefit analysis associated with any rule, to consider not just the benefits associated with a specific action, but other co-benefits, i.e. if you're regulating carbon dioxide, what might be benefits when it relates to hazardous air pollutants, traditional air pollutants. And that allows for arguably a rosier estimate about what the benefits might be. The Trump administration took a different view, but now the Biden administration's redoing that. And that could have significant impacts on a variety of environmental rulemakings over the next several years. And again, is just kind of an example of one of these technical but quite significant issues that EPA is dealing with and could have pretty profound impacts for the regulated community going forward. With that, I'll stop and turn it back to the group.
Thank you, Andrew. Let me see if I can pull everybody back in for the last 5 or 10 minutes or so of our discussion. You know, there's been a lot of talk about, you know, targeted agencies and what they're doing, but it seems to me that there is an overlap between many of them. And I know areas around healthcare, and I know labor is a big topic that comes up in our discussions. What's going on with the Affordable Care Act, HHS, many of those topics are there and may offer transitions from the last administration to the current one. So I wanted to just get you all's thoughts around kind of what we're seeing as shift and might expect in the labor space, but doubling back to healthcare, Governor Dean, and certainly what we might see with the Affordable Care Act. And I know there are some players out there who we haven't mentioned. That would be the state attorneys generals, who I've done a lot of work with, and sort of the impact you see them playing as we move this transition from one administration to the other. Let me just open it up.
Sure. Let me just briefly, because this country is so deeply polarized along somewhat ideological lines, but a lot of it's party lines. You are seeing something that I think has metastasized over the past maybe 6 or 8 years, which is large numbers of partisan attorney generals on either side suing the federal government. And a lot of the suits have to do with the way the rules making process has gone. That is, when you think, which regardless of which side you're on, you've achieved a victory, and the other side will come in and appeal this through the rules process, which makes the rules process is ponderous. And Congress is ponderous too. But as I said in my opening, the devil is in the details, and the details are really details. I mean, as I said, 3 lines in a rule can change a lot about what the intention is. So General Baker suggested that that healthcare is there's 2 reasons for healthcare regulations. One is the partisan differences over whether a Medicaid can be expanded without the consent of Congress or the states and so forth and so on. But the other is very, very detailed stuff. There was a lot of kinks in so-called Obamacare, and some of that was worked out through the rules process, and some of it continues to be worked out through the rules process. It turns out that that the problems on the exchanges could only be fixed if you made some changes in the way the bill was administered. So in general, a lot of what you see in the rules process around really big controversial issues, such as environmental, as Andrew was talking about, and such as healthcare, are very detailed, very complex, and bitterly partisan debates where, you know, frankly, one side usually, or sometimes another, will try to destroy an initiative put forth by a previous administration based on using the rules process.
General, you know, you brought up a good point, and that was the role of states attorneys generals in this process. They have, and certainly you saw it significantly in the Trump administration, they have jumped straight to the front of the line here in challenging efforts of an administration of another party and their ability to enact their legislative and regulatory agenda. In most recent example, and Governor Dean spoke about this earlier, it's the mandates. I mean, how long did it take for those, after those were announced, for 13 to, I think it was 13 Republican states attorney generals jump in and file suit? This seems to be the, and as I said, it's not new. It's getting a heck of a lot more attention. It seems to be, and no offense, sir, to the brethren, your brethren across the country, but it's a jumping point off to higher office, as we think and know. And let's grab some headlines by going after an administration. You certainly saw it, and as your good friend did often out in California during the last administration. I think Xavier Baca, I think if Donald Trump opened his mouth, Xavier Baca was going to try and sue him for it. So, or at least that was the feeling in the White House, was we can't take a step without this guy filing suit on something. That certainly has become a more active arena, and it's also an arena where businesses, as you know, and I think others do as well, businesses are going to those states' attorneys generals to get them involved here. This is there is a coordination, there is an effort, and of course, most famously, you can look back at Obamacare and the lawsuits that found their way into the Supreme Court. Those were largely driven by Republican states attorneys generals that wanted to undo the law because they couldn't repeal and replace it in the United States Senate.
You know, along those lines too, in terms of this tension, as John and Governor Dean have alluded to, between, for example, the rulemaking process and the activity of the attorneys generals around the country, there's also a significant amount of what I would call tension, and maybe even collaboration that you may see, but certainly tension as well between how these rules play out at the federal level and what happens down at the state and local level. And just using the standards in the Department of Labor related to Davis-Bacon wages, the Davis-Bacon Act, you will see the implication, or the implication is that you will see any rules changed around Davis-Bacon in loan documents, candidly, that a contractor may get to do a public service or a public works project in a local community like Atlanta, to pave a road. Because to the extent that the local government is receiving funding from the federal government that it then deploys for projects locally, any contractor providing that service is going to have to comply with those rules and regulations that have been handed down as a part of the Department of Labor's Davis-Bacon Wage Act modifications. And so that's a very real thing. And particularly, as we mentioned earlier, to the extent that you've got a significant amount of investment poised through the infrastructure bill, I think you'll see a significant amount of attention needing to be paid to how that act in and of itself, Davis-Bacon, plays out on the state and local level, and how it plays out not just in the halls of government, but literally how a private contractor who's receiving indirectly even federal funding will need to act, behave, as well as even put in place certain compliance as they go about performing their work for government.
Well, and you know what I'd say, and I apologize, Andrew, don't mean to step on you, but Department of Labor is also going to see a huge fight over the gig economy. And we need to keep in mind that these rules are also forward-looking, shall we say, and trying to address problems that are just starting to kind of to take shape. And I would also argue that much like EPA is a real battleground between parties, as is the Department of Labor. And with the Democrats in power, there will be a propensity to favor, to move in the pro-labor direction. With Republicans in power, you generally see the pendulum swing back to the employer, if you will. And I think the Davis-Bacon fight is a great example of what we're going to see on infrastructure, but soon to follow, though not quite announced yet in this in their fall presentation, because it's late. You're going to see some gig economy stuff, and that's going to get a lot of attention. You've certainly seen laws passed in the state of California. You've seen efforts really across the country to duplicate that. I think the administration is going to try in some way, shape, or form to memorialize those and make them national. And we should expect a a very, very tense fight over that in the coming months.
Andrew, you were about to comment. Then I have just a quick follow-up question for the panel. And so Andrew, let me get you on the box here and then I'll follow up.
Yeah, just I'll just be quick, but Caesar was talking about the impact of the infrastructure bill for states and localities and companies that do business with both and on the Davis-Bacon. I think that's completely true. And another issue that we're hearing a lot about, which is a regulatory issue, and there'll be each agency federally will have arguably their own guidance, is Buy America. I think a lot of folks thought that the Biden administration may take a less kind of America first approach when it comes to certain issues, but when it comes to Buy America, they've actually strengthened those rules or proposed strengthening them. And as this money goes out for the infrastructure bill and potentially reconciliation, that's going to be something that companies that do business with states and localities, not to mention the federal government, are going to have to look at. And there'll be different agency interpretations of Buy America requirements too, that will create a whole level of work for folks that are looking to do business with government.
Yeah, well said. Listen, we've got a number of general counsels on the call today and lawyers who represent corporate America. What advice would each one of you give to people on the call today about how they can get involved, how they can make a difference for their respective companies or law firms? The train seems to be moving, along the tracks now, and I'm not sure it's gone so far that we can't have an impact. But give some thought to and comment around what the people on this call today might be doing to move their agenda or their projects forward. Caesar, why don't I start with you and then we'll move across.
Well, I'll just say very, very, very briefly, knowing that the hour is short, is, we talked about economically significant actions. And I think it's very important for in-house counsel to review any actions that may be relevant to their particular industry, particularly to the extent that they may have an adverse impact upon them. And then have conversations with the internal client about how the impact on the sector may impact your company. And then from there, identify a really wonderful firm like Denton's that can help you navigate some of those issues, and not just at the federal level. I mean, certainly, as Governor Dean alluded, making comment and at the federal level is very important, but certainly to the extent that these rules take effect or have an impact, being able to navigate them in your local community or in your community of interest as a company.
Governor?
I'd say something very similar. And I think Caesar's point about don't just do this in Congress. This is happening in every state in the country. Rulemaking, it may not be as politicized, but the 3 words in a rule can change the intent of a legislature. So, I mean, the only thing I'd say, and, I guess I'll shamelessly follow Caesar's commercial for Denton's, just get yourself some people in DC and in the state capitals. Obviously, it doesn't have to be Denton's, but since we're all here, but you've got to have people watching this stuff. It is a tiny words make a difference. And there are going to be some companies that can have the breadth of doing this entirely internally, but there are not many. You've got to be in all 50 states, and you've got to be virtually in every agency in the federal government because stuff is going to get through in the middle of the night. If you don't know about it, you can't do much about it. And if you do know about it, you can. It's a hard process, but rules do get stopped. They do get changed. They do get litigated. But if you're behind the 8 ball, when the curtain comes down on the comment period, that's a big problem. You do not want to find out about a 3-word change in a rule that's going to completely change the meaning of what your plan was going to be in order to comply with a variety of regulations or even opportunities in cases where regulations are like Buy America. That's going to cut one way for firms that do a lot of business and create stuff outside the country. It's going to cut a completely different, the opposite way for a company whose mostly his production is in the United States. So just, you've got to, I mean, again, some of you will be able to have a legal department that's so voluminous that you can cover all of this, but not many of you will be. And you just got to find some people that can be on hand all the time, and they better be good.
John, 3-time top lobbyist in DC. What's the secret?
Here's the number
What
one
advice
rule.
did you get?
Here's the number one rule in Washington, D.C. Then, by the way, the 3 times is because we've paid our bill on time 3 times. So that's why the subscription was paid. So that's why it happened. Nobody loves you when your hair is on fire in Washington. Plain and simple. Build relationships now. Pay attention to what your trade associations are sending you. I know that Friday afternoon Washington update from your trade association probably makes its way into your inbox and stays there. Open it up. Read it. They generally won't be very long. I know the guys that are writing them. So make sure that you're educated in the process. This stuff, as Governor Dean says, the rules may happen overnight, but the process is there. And you've got to be paying attention to just what's happening. You do that through your trade association. It's also pretty important to understand who your electeds are at the federal level and to build a relationship with them. That does not mean write them a political check. That actually means introduce them to your company, introduce them to your people, let them know what they do. Let me let you in on a little secret. Yes, campaign money is great and important, but they'd rather have votes, and they'd rather have votes of all the family members of that person that works in your office. So that is important, to have relationships here in Washington, to pay attention to what the trade association is telling you. And I will demur as to whether or not you need a Denton's lobbyist, but it is important to be engaged, because if nobody loves you when your hair is on fire is true, it is also very true that if you ain't at the table, you on the menu, and nobody wants to be on the menu on a Friday afternoon at 4:30 when the rule comes out.
Andrew, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, taking a little bit where my colleagues have gone, I would say, don't assume that the said federal agency knows how your business or industry works. And also don't assume that they aren't interested. I think they do care. They are interested, but they're not on the front lines. They don't have the commercial, they don't have the operations knowledge, and I think they benefit from having that. It doesn't mean that the rule is going to end in a way that you're wholly supportive of. The other thing I would say is administrations change, the political priorities when it comes to rulemaking change, but those senior career staff largely stay the same. And those are the people that are writing the rules, whether it be a Biden or Trump or Obama administration. And there's value in building relationships with those folks because they're there for the long haul.
I would certainly agree with all that's been said by my colleagues, and just add from my perspective as a former attorney general, they become a very powerful political force around the country. And so as you're advising your clients about what's happening in Washington, D.C., there is certainly a lot of connective tissue between what's happening in the halls of Congress and what's happening with state attorneys generals, as we've seen them get more and more involved in what many would consider to be national issues, but they're having a tremendous impact. So put that on your list of things to do. It might be well worth your while to set up a 30-minute to an hour meeting if you've got an issue that you think might be important and that state attorneys generals can help you with. So let me say to the panel again, thank you very much. We are right at the top of the hour. I don't see any questions in the chat room. So I'm going to say thank you again. I hope the people viewing have enjoyed this panel as much as I have. A lot of expertise here, and certainly we're here to help. With that, I'm going to conclude this panel session. I don't know if Sterling is still.
I'm here. Thank you, Thurbert. Thanks, Caesar, Governor, John, Andrew. Appreciate a great discussion. With that, I'll keep us moving, and I will kick it to Laura Hewitt to introduce her panelists and let us know what we don't know about ESG. So with that, I'll kick to Laura.
I'm working to try to get my camera on. I'm actually going to kick it over to Mark, because Mark is the one who we have elected to moderate.
Sounds great. Mark, I will go to you then.
Very, very honored to be the moderator. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us on this Friday afternoon. My name is Mark Lindsey. I'm a partner at the ESG advisory firm, Sustainable Governance Partners. And I am particularly excited about this panel because there really is no hotter topic within the investor community right now than how environmental, social, and governance issues impact companies' long-term financial value. When I talk to my former colleagues at Vanguard, when I talk to friends at other asset managers, it's always shocking, even to those of us who have been doing this for a while, to see just the level and flurry of activity that's going on within asset managers to develop new ESG funds, to integrate ESG into traditional mutual funds or ETFs, to really ramp up their proxy voting. Now, of course, this tidal wave of activity within the investor community means that investors are in turn pressuring companies, right, to enhance their own ESG practices and provide more disclosure, more public disclosure about what companies themselves are doing to optimize the ESG, their performance on the ESG issues that matter. And that's why I'm so excited to have three amazing panelists today who can share the perspective of being deep in the company trenches, right, as that investor pressure comes to bear. And maybe we'll just start off. I'll ask each panelist to introduce themselves. And perhaps we can start with you, Amisha, and then we can move down our virtual line we have here.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amisha Cote, and I am an assistant GC of corporate and securities over at National Vision. We are an optical retailer with about over 1,200 stores in 44 states. Which I think will be important as we think about the business impacts of ESG strategy. And I joined the company about around January 2020, specifically to help them as they began their ESG initiative as well.
Mark, I'm not sure who's next on your list. I think all of our orders may be a little bit different. Why don't I go ahead and go next? So Laura Hewitt with Southern Company. My title is VP Corporate Governance, and really I'm a sort of former securities lawyer who now deals with ESG issues day in and day out in thinking through how we engage with our institutional investors on these areas, trying to keep up with things as they're coming at us, working to make sure senior management and the board knows the trends and what to expect. And thinking through disclosures that we need to do, that we should do, that maybe we want to think about, and the risks that might relate to those issues as well. And I've been here. So Southern Company is a holding company. Our businesses are Georgia Power, Alabama Power, Mississippi Power, Southern Company Gas, as well as some unregulated businesses. Have been here since about 2015. And I'm going to turn it over to Neil.
Thanks, Laura. I'm Neil Simon. I am a securities lawyer by title, although since joining UPS a few years ago, my responsibilities have transitioned a little bit and include board governance advisory work, supporting our finance and accounting functions, as well as treasury and investor relations. I also lead what we at UPS call our Investor ESG program, which is an outreach program that has developed over the last few years as the interest in this topic has grown. In case anyone doesn't know, UPS operates the big brown package delivery cars, and interestingly, from the ESG space, operates one of the 10 largest airlines in the world. So thanks, Mark and Laura, and look forward to a good discussion this afternoon.
Terrific. Thank you all. And I am going to try and share my screen here. And I know easier said than done, but hopefully everyone can now see my screen. Am I doing okay?
Looks good, Mark.
Perfect. Before we start, a couple of opening notes and one big caveat. So first, the panel materials include this slide deck that you see in front of you. We're not going to walk through all of the slides. That seems like a really unjust punishment on a Friday afternoon, but we will refer to some items, and we encourage you to skim through this, at your leisure. Great weekend reading. Second, please submit questions throughout the panel. We'll leave some time at the end for Q&A, but we'd love to weave in any questions that you have throughout the next hour and try and make this as interactive as a virtual panel can be. And then finally, and this is the big caveat, the world of ESG is quite fluid and evolving rapidly, right? So it's essential to keep an eye on investor preferences because their expectations today around ESG issues may not be the same as when they are voting at your next annual meeting. So definitely something to keep an eye on all the time. And what we say today might be different than what we would say 3 months from now. Moreover, and we're going to talk about this throughout the panel, the SEC, as well as regulatory agencies throughout the world, are actively engaged in rulemaking around a number of these areas, right? So that includes climate disclosures way up there on the SEC's rulemaking agenda. So is human capital management disclosure. So we'll discuss the implications of some of these new rules, but I think it's important to keep that in mind and also understand any new rules that come out are probably not going to replace this disclosure structure that we have out there and we're going to talk about. But if anything, it could even muddy the waters further. So with that all being said, let's get into it. And hopefully you can see me kind of flipping through the slides. Perfect. ESG has truly become the new standard of investing. And those aren't my words. Those are the words of Larry Fink, CEO of the largest asset manager in the world, BlackRock. They control, I think it's about 10 trillion, with a T, trillion dollars of investments. And ESG has moved to the top of their agenda, and it's moved to the top of the agenda of really most mainstream asset managers and really all types of asset managers, right? So that includes your passive investors, right? So these are your asset managers whose funds, their sole goal is to track an index like the S&P 500. Well, passive investors are now weighing in on issues like climate change and DE&I, not because they see themselves as social warriors, but because they are very concerned about the systemic risk associated with these issues, right? To the extent that climate change diminishes GDP over time, this is going to diminish the value of their clients' portfolios, which is the whole market, and that's why they care, right? At the same time, you have active investors. They see opportunity here because, frankly, over the last few years, the last 5-10 years, they've been losing market share to the passives. And the active investors see ESG factors as things they can integrate into their stock picking and potentially outperform the market, right? If they buy those companies who do ESG well, who are ESG improvers, and if they sell those who are ignoring key ESG issues. So you have your passives, you have your actives. One thing I should have said about the passives is they've grown in market share. There's a very good chance that BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street are among your top shareholders. They are of nearly every public company in the world or in the US, and they're only getting bigger. So ESG to us, right? This is not a cyclical trend. This is a secular trend that is going to continue to grow. And then, in part, it's also due, and we'll be frank about this, to the marketing component of this. With the wealth transfer from boomers to millennials, right, and more individual investors wanting their stock portfolio to reflect their personal values, institutional investors see ESG as something that sells. So with all of that as context, maybe I can turn it over because I'd love to hear from all three of the panelists to tell us a little bit about your investor base, right? Who are your top shareholders? And then more importantly, are your shareholders asking about your ESG practices? And maybe we can start with you, Laura.
Sure. Yep, happy to jump in first. So Mark, really appreciate the introduction. And I think everything you have articulated, I can confirm. As we talk about our investor base, for example, our top 3 shareholders are Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street. And they collectively hold, I think you have an average here of 22% was on your slide, and ours is, it varies between sort of 21 and 23%. And that, shifts a little bit over the years, but I guess we are representative of sort of the typical ownership of an S&P 500 company of those big 3 investors. But when you think more broadly about our investor base, We also, as a sort of a company that has been around for more than 100 years, we have a very large retail investor base as well. So we have 40 to 45% retail holders, which leaves sort of 50 to 60% institutional holders, split between about half active and half passive. But there's no doubt with Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street making up, about 22%, that they can swing a vote or a decision or a framework that we choose to follow. A lot of things can sort of be an up and down by what they tell us, what they put out in writing, and the engagement that we have with them over time. So are they asking us, our investors, about ESG practices? Absolutely they are. We have seen a growth. I think if you go back about 5 or 6 years, probably the focus was more on governance, but we have seen obviously an explosion in E&S topics. And when we are engaging on ESG, I would say that our number one issue that we find investors want to talk about is climate risk. So maybe we'll pass it on to Amisha next.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I think coming at this from a unique standpoint, its National Vision just went public in 2017. So we've been doing investor engagement for about 3 years, as we've been public for about 4 years now. And our investors, primarily were engaged with us on evolving our corporate governance structures that were legacy private equity governance structures that we had in place, and have evolved from, looking at that with us as we removed our classified board and supermajority provisions to now focusing on E&S issues for us as well. And as Laura noted, we have a mix of long-term holders and index funds. So BlackRock and Vanguard are 2 of our largest holders. And with both of their holdings, we're about 20%. JP Morgan is also one of our top holders as well. So the focus on E&S has certainly come to the forefront for us. Even prior to this latest round of engagement this fall with our investors, we have had questions and solicited feedback from our investors about these areas. So they have been focused on National Vision developing its ESG strategy since we just recently published our first corporate responsibility report this October. So we have engaged with them about feedback, and really their focus has been on what standards the company would be looking to disclose under, what would be relevant to our business from an ESG perspective. And they've also, been thinking about specific issues to hone in on because of our business, which I think is at the core of what they're interested in. And this year, I think a lot of the focus was on supplier accountability and also on cybersecurity this year. So those are some of the topics we touched on, but really, I think when you're looking at Vanguard and BlackRock, they're going to be focused on how companies are focused on their business and the materiality of how the business operates with respect to the ESG disclosure that they're putting out there. So that's kind of been how a lot of our investor engagement has gone this year.
Great, and maybe Neil, you could give a sense of what you're seeing at UPS, and also curious, as you're talking with investors within this broad universe of ESG issues, what issues are you hearing your investors focus on, and then also, what are your executive team and your board spending their time on?
Thanks, Mark. Let me start with just a quick detour and a thank you to you, and a plug as well. I strongly encourage anyone who is either in the house and dealing with these issues or advising companies that deal with them to download this PowerPoint. Like Mark said, we're not going to go through every slide, but he and his team just did a tremendous job putting together chapter and verse on key issues. And while the devil's in the details, and like he said, may change, this is phenomenal and will be a great reference tool for anybody. We at UPS are similar to Laura in terms of shareholder base. Our 3 largest institutional holders are just about everyone else's: BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. We have some unique issues in that we maintain a dual class voting structure, which reduces to a certain extent the potential voting influence by those or other institutional holders. But our dual class structure is unique in and of itself in that the super voting shares we have are not concentrated in any way. Management holds and controls less than 1% of the vote. They are held primarily by the shares by employees or retirees of UPS in a very unique and storied history that we're very proud of, candidly. What's interesting about that is as ESG conversations have developed, and I'm old enough to remember when if investors asked about an ESG issue, companies just wouldn't even engage, right? Companies just pushed them to the side and said, we're going to manage the company, vote with your feet if you don't want to support management. Could not have been a bigger sea change in terms of what we see now, but our discussions have since transitioned from governance related issues, including our dual class, to more of the E&S. We engage regularly with holders large and small on what we're doing in the environmental and climate space, what we're doing, especially since the onset of COVID and the challenges with sheltering and delivering goods and supply chain issues, how we've treated our people and managed our business. That is not to say that governance issues have been pushed to the side, because one of the things we do with our engagement program is take the feedback we get every year and do a presentation to our board. When we think about what our governance principles are, and even now more broadly, what our environmental and social principles are, we will go sit with the board and say, here were the key feedback. Here was the key feedback we received this year. This is what investors care about. This is what they're asking us to do. Let's reevaluate what we're doing and what's really important. So that's how we think about it internally.
That's great. And you know, I think there's a couple points that you raised, Neil, that we should definitely circle back on investor engagement, because that is, to your point, something that, you know, has really changed over the last 5-10 years. Maybe before we get there, we'll just follow up on a point you made, Amisha, around a lot of the discussions that you're having with investors, or the feedback you're having, is around disclosure, right? And this is one of the big challenges in the space. When we talk about ESG, unfortunately, we've jammed in like 40 different issues, right, that aren't necessarily related to each other under this acronym. And there's a lot that you could disclose, right? And then also, we don't have, for the most part, kind of mandated disclosure from the SEC or really most regulators. So it's very, one of the big challenges investors have is getting kind of that comparable decision useful information. And we'll jump around a little bit to, let's see if I can do this right, to slide 18, but I'd love to hear from you, you know, how you've tackled that disclosure challenge. You know, we have these voluntary disclosure frameworks that have evolved with investor and company input. You know, have you looked to the frameworks to guide you? Have you looked to other issues as you've thought about crafting your disclosure, and who within the company, you know, helps you do that? What different groups and divisions within the business own ESG disclosure?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. You know, as we thought about our ESG strategy and the disclosure around it, I think the biggest thing was thinking about investor feedback, stakeholder feedback. So internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, what they were interested in. But I think the core of it starts with what our business is. And as a retail company, you know, we are also focused on our store locations, our retail locations, our associates. So that was important as we thought about ESG reporting as well. And I think this year, one point that Neil highlighted with COVID and other important events from 2020, you know, that was also a top of mind for investors, but also something that kind of shaped how we went into thinking about our disclosure when we thought about the health and safety of our retail associates, when we thought about DEI issues for our associate base as well. So I think that kind of steered the ship in a sense that may have been unique for 2020 with respect to ESG disclosure. But the initial thing we did was engaging with investors from the start, even before developing a strategy about what their main focus areas were. And then looking internally at the business and understanding kind of materiality wise how our business operated, what were the environmental, social impacts of our business, and what were gap and opportunity areas for us and where we could improve. We looked at the standards, and I think in engaging with investors, there were certainly preferences from investors on standards. I think TCFD was certainly mentioned, but GRI was one that a number of our investors also mentioned to us, as with SASB as well. So I think in a sense there was a spectrum from them, and because we were at a unique stage where we were first developing our strategy and first putting out a report, there was a little bit of flexibility from investors with us in the sense of, we'll give you our input and views on these frameworks, but we are going to give the company a little bit of leeway now. TCFD is a unique area as well. So for us, initially kicking that off, we certainly looked at that from a climate change perspective. We did our first GHG emissions report as well for us, but we did not report along TCFD. So I think with respect to that, investors understood that we're kind of getting our feet under us and wanted to understand where we were from a carbon emission standpoint first, internally at the company. So a little bit of investors kind of giving us their input on frameworks, but also us thinking about it from a business and industry perspective too. What would really work and would be suitable for us in order to report as a retail company and as a healthcare company as well. I'm sure Laura and Neil might have some different perspectives there on frameworks and how investors may engage with them on that.
Sure, I'm happy to provide a little input here, but I actually think it's not going to be too different, Amisha, than what you've described. I mean, we've been around a little longer and probably started this journey a little earlier than National Vision. And even knowing that there is some consensus around frameworks is a huge positive development from our perspective, because if you go back about 4 or 5 years, what SASB looks like today is very different than where they started back 5 years ago. And, TCFD really came about, again, sort of about 5 years ago. And I think what we have seen in the last 3 years is that coalescing of our largest investors around these two key frameworks for us. As we've been engaging, and I know we'll talk about engagement a little more towards the end of our presentation, but it is always a question that we ask when we engage is, are there particular frameworks that the investor is looking at or thinks are, good or more important frameworks? And we may get into this, we may not, but we also ask them, if they're using any of these ESG raters and rankers, which ones they're relying on and where they get their data. Because what we have found is that there are just so many different ones out there that we don't, I think sometimes smaller companies think larger companies have an unlimited budget and unlimited resources. And the reality is that is just not the case. We still all feel like we're trying to do too much with not enough. And so we had to make some hard decisions about which were the ones that were most important. So in our particular industry, though, EEI came up with its own benchmark, so this Eei ESG reporting template, which predated SASB and TCFD to a certain extent. So that is where we started. And then we've added SASB and TCFD. GRI, to the extent that what we're reporting matches GRI, we focus on that, but we don't independently try to do a full GRI report. And Neil may have some additional thoughts as well.
So we are actually doing, well, this year we checked the box for all 3 reports, the SASB, TCFD, and the GRI report. And I will deny this, especially if someone from the SEC is listening on the phone, but to a certain extent, we are hopeful that if the commission does put out some rulemaking with mandated reporting, that there are certain frameworks or scopes within the mandate because we are examining, like you said, Laura, the cost from a person and hard dollar perspective of doing all these reports. What we found is, and I know we'll talk about this later, but the asks don't stop even when you do a SASB, a TCFD, and a sustainability report. So if there is certainty, or if the SEC or another regulator comes out and says, here is the framework that you need to publicly report on, we are going to start internally having discussions about, is that enough? And that will likely turn into an external discussion as well with our key stakeholders. Because when we get into the why of this, what we're hearing is that investors don't care for caring's sake. They care so that they can do comparisons across companies and across industries. So if everyone had similar data, it would help them. And some of them, or a fair number of them, are call it standard agnostic.
Oh, Mark, I think you might be on mute.
Oh, whoops. A couple of points I heard that I just want to reemphasize, because I think they are absolutely fantastic points, which is, one, just this whole space is sort of messy, and we've thrown out a lot of acronyms. And if you haven't heard those acronyms, there's also like 20 other acronyms, and it's a little messy because SASB is merging with the ISSB, and CDSB is merging in there too. I think the important piece, and we have a lot of companies who come to us and say, like, where do we even start, or how do we get our arms around this, is Laura's point, right? There is more convergence than there ever has been before. And as both Amisha and Neil pointed out, you also want to talk to your investors, because there's some flexibility around this, right? To take a comply or explain approach. Investors don't just want disclosure for disclosure's sake. If some of these metrics that the frameworks are asking for are not relevant, they'd rather have you say, this isn't relevant. Here are the KPIs you should really be focused on. So it can be really confusing, but it also, and I'm going to steal a line from the panel before us, this is not brain surgery or rocket science, because that's, I'm doing it. So we know it's not brain surgery or rocket science. I think one of the points I also heard was, look, the way companies are measuring some of these metrics, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions, and we're talking about scope 3 emissions, whether it's kind of internal human management metrics, even around, diversity and equity inclusion, whether it's a whole host of these metrics, the methodologies are not nearly as mature as what you see in, your GAAP financial statements. And, I'd be curious, and maybe Laura, you can start with this, about like the legal concerns that you have around those challenges, and then what actions, we can realistically take today to mitigate those.
Sure. If there is something that keeps me up at night as a sort of former securities lawyer, you probably never get the securities out of the lawyer. It's, the disclosures we're making and whether investors are relying on those disclosures in making investment decisions. And if so, the comfort level we have around the investment grade nature of that information. I think if you go back, not too far in the past, many companies' sustainability reports and disclosures were put out, and I saw this from somewhere, I didn't write this, a spreadsheet and a prayer. And I think that is a lot of the ways that companies pulled information together to report it out. Well, we clearly understand that investors are looking for this information. They are comparing us against peers with respect to some of this information. We know the SEC has been articulated as looking at asking for more disclosure about this. So something at Southern Company that we have been thinking long and hard about is getting those internal controls and processes in place such that the information that we do disclose is as close as we can get to being the type of investor grade information that we're already putting in our 10Ks and our financial statements. So one of the things that we actually undertook this year is we engaged our auditor to do an assurance readiness assessment. We picked a handful of topics that we thought were key areas where investors were looking at our information, and we let our auditors come in and we set up, working groups and working teams, and they interviewed folks internally. They looked at our processes and they made recommendations for how we might be able to improve those processes. Coming out of that, we also decided to engage our auditor to do a third-party assurance on our greenhouse gas emissions, beginning with this year and going forward. As a company like ours that is in the electric utility and gas utility operations, we know climate risk is number one on many of our investors' minds, and greenhouse gas emissions happens to be, I think, the number one request for information that we get, and the way that we are measured against peers in so many different ways, our existing emissions and how they're declining over time. So that seemed to us to be the right area to start this focus and to start that third-party assurance process. But I anticipate that that is going to expand over time. And, when the SEC puts out their proposed rules, that may accelerate the process in getting auditors involved and thinking through how those disclosures need to be prepared with the same level of confidence that we do for anything else we file with the SEC.
Laura, I'm kind of wondering if you were sitting in my meetings yesterday. We yesterday had another discussion with some of our key leaders, which tells you, this is an important issue. We actually already have our auditors provide assurance on our sustainability reporting. We've been producing a sustainability report for 20 years now, but it is not, like you say, necessarily auditable information, meaning we don't have the internal controls that we would need for something to be audited. Especially as it relates to the potential disclosure of scope 3 data, which is subject to so many estimates, so many assumptions, and almost equally importantly, has a longer runway for reporting internally and externally. It's not something you can grab like financial results and necessarily report when your 10Q or your 10K would be reported. So the challenges are real in terms of how we manage that internally, trying to remove or increase automation in the data gathering and analysis process. So it's both quicker and equally or more importantly, it's accurate data that gets put out, whether it's in an SEC filing or not. Right, whether it's subject to a CEO or CFO certification in a periodic report or otherwise, there is a strong desire to have a level of confidence in the data that really lets us look our stakeholders in the eye and say this is right. And the interesting thing is, we feel like we need that across companies and across industries for investors really to be able to do an apples to apples comparison.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And look, I think this is also where companies are going to get more pressure from investors, because what we hear from investors is, okay, we're finally getting the disclosure. And when we compare the numbers, it's really clear that people are using very different methodologies, right? So we're kind of back to where we were before, where it's apples and oranges. So I think that's spot on. A couple points I would just add. I'm definitely stealing the spreadsheet in a prayer line. I love that. And unfortunately, that's that is the reality. But the second point is, I think there are more and more providers out there who can help companies on their journey. Certainly the Big Four and other accounting firms have bolstered their ESG reporting capabilities. There's more software platforms that you can use and that even tie in with some of these voluntary frameworks. And then hopefully, to Laura's point, SEC rulemaking and some of these other external catalysts will drive some more consistency there. I did want to pick up, I think we talked, there was a discussion earlier about raters and rankers, and we can't completely skip over this because, I like to call the third-party ESG ratings, and hopefully there's no ratings providers on this call, catnip for newbies, right? You see a AAA, you see a BBB, and people are like, wow, I figured this whole ESG stuff out, right? But you have a challenge where there's a ton of different ESG raters. They have and rankers, they have different methodologies. They often come up with different scores. And frankly, we see a lot of investors kind of using them maybe as a gut check or to screen out laggards. But what they're really looking at is, they're building their own methodology for thinking about ESG. They are not relying as much on these third-party rankers as they used to be. And I'm curious if in the company's experience, if you're also seeing that. And I think we do have a slide up here, so I'll try and scan to that. But maybe as we're doing, maybe Amisha, you could talk to that, but also talk about, right, because you only have a limited bandwidth. Is it worthwhile focusing on your own disclosure, or making sure that you have good ratings from all of these and the 20 other ESG rankers?
Yeah, Mark, that's a really good point. And, as Neil and Laura highlighted, this is pretty time consuming, and the groups that are focused on this internally are also focused on, year-round investor engagement, and our finance and accounting teams, and our management operations teams. So there is a limited bandwidth on being able to go through all of the third-party rating services and review all the ratings, and also making sure that we would agree with what we had put out there from a disclosure standpoint, and understanding that the ratings were updated. Some of these rating agencies, even after putting out a corporate sustainability and responsibility report, will still want you to go to their sites and update the materials on their sites in order to update their ratings as well, which again is also time consuming for the internal teams to do. We did look at a few of these, MSCI was certainly important, Sustainalytics had been highlighted to us by investors as well, but we more focused on our disclosure and what we were putting out there, answering what investors had highlighted to us, and also what we thought was relevant from an ESG perspective, from an industry perspective. And one thing that I will highlight here is a large focus was also on not only the disclosure and the content that we were putting out there, but putting it in a format in which the data aggregation services could actually lift that material. Something that until we really got into the weeds on developing our ESG strategy and putting the report together, I think wasn't fully understood. And I think it's an issue all companies face, which is we might put this disclosure out there, but you actually need to put it out there in a format in which the aggregation services are able to lift that in order to then pass it on, whether they're passing it on to any ratings agencies as well, or whether other investors are also pulling it from there. And that's, kind of what we focused on. That was a way for us to get out our content, our message, and kind of focus on 3 or 4 of the rating agencies that we wanted to make sure understood what we were doing and accomplishing. But honestly, I think the best method to get our message out there was to talk to investors in our investor engagement. So not only highlighting what our ratings might be, but to walk them through certain specifics about why our ratings in this area might be there, or what our data actually is out there about this, because I think those one-on-one conversations actually gave them a lot of insight and gave them more of the context about not only our business, but about what we were trying to accomplish, which I think would impact how investors consider the company as they're kind of evaluating it from an ESG perspective as well.
That's a great point. That's a great point. Yeah, I think it's not something you can ignore, but it's also something you don't want to dedicate your ESG programs around, satisfying the rankers. I want to be cognizant of time and quickly move on to the next topic. Neil had referenced sort of the sea change we saw around shareholders or investors focus on ESG. And looking at last year's proxy season, I won't go through this in detail because the numbers tell the story, but we saw that sea change manifest itself right in the voting. We saw support levels for shareholder proposals skyrocket to all-time highs when investors like BlackRock and Vanguard changed their voting policies. We saw some investors, most notably BlackRock, escalate their tactics and vote against directors at companies that they view as ESG laggards. And we expect to see more investors follow that course this year. I would say, in 2022, at least from what we're seeing with our clients and hearing from investors, We do expect more of the same. Your shareholder proponents, the folks submitting these proposals, they're emboldened. They had really high success levels. They also know, based on recent changes at the SEC, it's a lot harder for companies to get no action relief and leave E&S proposals off the ballot. And this is why we're seeing more proposals than we typically do, and a really broad range of types of proposals being submitted to companies right now. So this includes dozens of climate-related proposals that are being submitted, not just to oil and gas companies, right, but to companies in all sectors. One interesting piece around those proposals is, historically, a lot of these proposals have been saying, give us more climate-related disclosure. Now the proposals are saying, well, you have targets, right? Emission reduction targets aligned with Paris, or if you don't, why don't you, right? So these proposals are no longer just looking for disclosure, they're looking for action. We've already seen over 50 proposals submitted asking for companies to provide more transparency into their political activity. This was one of the biggest shifts last year. We saw a lot of proposals focused on companies' political activity that passed. And we think that those proposals are going to get really high support levels again this year. Diversity and racial justice continue to be a focus area in these proposals. More and more of them are also asking for companies to undertake independent audit of their related practices, whether it's their internal diversity practices or whether it's their impact on communities of color with their operations. So this is a huge understatement, but 2022 is going to be a really interesting year. And we think more of this continuation of support for E&S proposals, support for E&S concepts. And maybe, Laura and Neil, we can just kind of take one quick step back. We're seeing more and more proposals come in, but your companies have received a lot of proposals over the years. Oftentimes, those are going to a vote at your meetings. Can you walk us through just sort of the nuts and bolts of the process you follow when you get a new proposal in your mailbox?
Sure, I'll go ahead and start. Thanks, Mark. Yes, we certainly have had our share of proposals over the years. When that proposal does come in the door, and I do want to make it clear, we partner with some outside counsel folks as well as a proxy solicitor who really are instrumental for us in this process. But we want to make sure that we work on, the technical issues. There are hoops that a proponent does need to jump through, and you want to make sure that you look at the hygiene. Is everything done correctly? If it's not, making sure that you follow the rules to notify the proponent of any problems with their submission. Because if you do end up having to go to the SEC on a procedural problem, you want to make sure you can document that, because that certainly is a way to not have the proposal appear on your ballot. Assuming that the technical passes, then you are really looking at the substantive nature of that proposal. And Mark, as you sort of alluded to before, I think that a few years ago, 3-4 years ago, we probably spent more time really looking at some of these substantive arguments you can make to the SEC to try to get no action relief through the various avenues available under Rule 14A8. But I think what we actually came to this conclusion on our own, and then the SEC has sort of flip-flopped in how they're looking at this themselves, that trying to go to the SEC to get things excluded is a little bit of a double-edged sword. So we have really taken the approach of aiming to engage with our proponents early and often to see if there is a way to find an agreement to have that proposal withdrawn and have it not appear on our ballot. Historically, we've had very good success with that. And we have found that most of our shareholder proponents are people that we know well and that we engage with regularly. And it does facilitate the process if you know them. To the extent that we get a proposal from a new investor, a new shareholder proponent, we will work with our proxy solicitor and our outside advisors to better understand, who they are, whether they have a history of entering into withdrawal agreements, what what the voting has been on that proposal in the past to have a good idea as to whether we think our investors would support it or not. And that really does guide our strategy in the negotiation process with the proponents. I mean, again, the aim is to have no shareholder proposals, if at all possible, in our proxy statement. We were actually able to do that in 2021. So as I look at some of these numbers, I know we got a little lucky last year. I do think with these numbers, shareholder proponents are emboldened, and I do think 2022 may be a very different year. I'm very hopeful we'll still be able to negotiate those withdrawals, but I'm not so sure shareholder proponents are going to be as willing to settle for less than what they're asking for in 2022. And Neil, curious sort of how you're approaching it at UPS.
Sound like a broken record, but Laura, what you are doing is best practice because it sounds very similar to what we're doing. A couple of maybe nuances from our side, and you may do this as well, but we've noticed that with a lot of our shareholder proponents, we will actually engage with them because we generally return calls and letters, but they will want to talk with us to understand our business, our disclosures, and some of our policies before even submitting a proposal. And we generally do that outside of a couple of, just call it gadflies, where we know we won't make any headway. John Chevedden's not going to withdraw his proposal relating to our capital structure. But we've had reasonable success in the past, especially when there's a real special interest behind the proposal. We've used a number of avenues, including some of our lobbying efforts in DC, the help of our proxy solicitor, and even outside experts like outside counsel. One of the things we are seeing, Mark, and you said this, is each year when the proposals come in, and in many cases they result in more and more disclosure so that you are being a good corporate citizen, the proposals now want more specifics in terms of the actions to get from point A to point B. And when you get there, it can be a lot harder to negotiate a withdrawal because there's not as much, you don't have as many arrows in the quiver in terms of things you can offer without capitulating to the proposal, which may not be the right thing to do for a number of reasons, whether it's cost prohibitive or whether there are competitive concerns. So I suspect as the proposals get more specific, it's going to continue to get more challenging to negotiate. But like Laura, I mean, we do it early and we do it often.
And I would echo, just I think what you're doing is certainly best practices, right? It's the right answer is not to give proponents that Heisman stiff arm and just ignore them, right? Because a couple of reasons. Yes, they are challenging conversations at times, but these proponents are oftentimes willing to settle on some middle ground. But they're also, these same proponents are talking with the bigger investors who are going to drive whether or not this proposal passes or not. They're having conversations with the big three and other large investors. And what you don't want is them going to those investors and saying, oh, not only are they're not doing what we asked for, but they're very difficult to work with and they're not even listening to their shareholders. That's kind of one of the cardinal sins.
Yeah, and I mean, from a pragmatic perspective, I don't know that this has moved the needle, but there is the consideration of if you're not engaging and you have a challenging relationship with your holders, not only are they emboldened to submit a proposal, but they may reconsider their vote on some of the management proposals, probably most importantly as it relates to director elections. And I don't think any of us want to hear from our directors with a question of why was my vote for percentage down so much this year?
And they do ask, by the way. They want to know, like, why was mine 2% compared to, it's interesting. They really do pay attention to their own vote. And when they understand and appreciate what might drive a vote against or a recommendation against, that is one way you certainly get the board's attention.
So I'm going to skip over activism, even though I think we could spend an entire hour talking about how ESG is becoming more and more a component of hedge fund activism, because I do want to talk about, and I think we have a great segue here to investor engagement, right? We talked about how this has changed over the years. 5-10 years ago, companies were not talking to passive investors like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street. They were not talking to T. Rowe and Fidelity about ESG. Suddenly, they are, right, on both fronts. And also, investors increasingly, not all the time, but sometimes want to talk with independent directors about this stuff. So, maybe we can kick off with you, Amisha, because you mentioned recently building that investor engagement program. But could you talk about that program, including, who the internal teams are, who are involved, who leads, who participates in those discussions?
Yeah, certainly, Mark. We've had our investor engagement program now, obviously for at least three years. And as we think about that, we have a head of investor relations who manages all investor engagement year round, as you mentioned, specifically around the time of our earnings and periodic reports, but also engages in the off season as well. And with respect to the off-season engagement, which we think is the most important, normally happening in the fall for us, fall and winter, we'll have our investor relations team, we'll have our legal team, the general counsel, myself, our chief people officer from an executive compensation side as well, to really kind of set up meetings with some of not just our top holders, but really investors that we've engaged a lot with as well, to solicit feedback about how the company had done so far on the year, but also with respect to COVID was especially a big topic for us, and how are we managing that? We, shut down some retail locations temporarily when in March of 2020. And so I think with respect to investors, there was a lot of trying to understand how we were managing the health and safety of our associates, how we were safely reopening. Those were questions during off-season engagement as well. But off-season engagement, I think, is a great time for us to focus on our governance and our ESG, to really ask them, based on how the year has gone and what they've kind of seen as trends and hot topics for themselves as they look at other companies and other companies in our industry, what they would like for us to consider. And what we've put out there this year, how proxy season went for us, what they saw with respect to what we're doing in our ESG strategy, and also what we're doing with respect to executive compensation, to kind of have that dialogue back and forth to make sure they understand the context of all of the decision-making that we do and disclosure that we put out there with respect to our business and what we're considering internally as well, but also to hear from them, to hear how they view certain disclosure that we've put, certain actions that we've taken as a company. And so I think the off-season engagement is kind of the most important for us from a feedback perspective on ESG, and really helped us kind of think about what we would like to make sure is getting out there from a company message on our strategy and our priorities, but also what we should consider for the next year. What are investors focused on the next turn? Compensation with certain ESG metrics built in has certainly been something that's been a big topic. And obviously companies that are more mature have certainly been looking at that, but something that also we hear investors talk about. And so there are topics that we will have in our future that get raised, and it's a great time for us to engage with them, hear their thoughts, and consider how this will be part of the company's strategy going forward, and how we'll discuss it with management and the board. So I think that's been the best part. And the three kind of teams that we have here are the best to answer investor questions, from the legal governance side, investor relations side, and then the people side as well, and the compensation side. So we manage that in the fall, and then we do some engagement throughout the year as well. I think for us that was important, especially as we developed our ESG strategy and hit certain milestones this year, to let them know when we had our website up, when our emissions report was first published over the summer. So it's a continuous engagement program, with really the meat of it coming in the fall and winter. And I think probably for Neil and Laura, same with the fall winter timeframe, but I'm sure there's some differing with respect to some of the larger holders that you guys may engage with as well.
And maybe if it's okay, Laura, I'll jump in because I see there's actually in the Q&A queue a question for you that, and I want to be sensitive to time as well. So real quick, from our perspective, I think it's a little different in that we have a robust and actually a wonderful IR team that is doing year-round what I call financial engagement on traditional IR issues. Predating me moving over to UPS, there was a program where the company did some outreach on the ESG side, just in advance of proxy season, asking investors if they wanted to talk, if they had any issues they wanted to raise with us from a disclosure, from a governance perspective. And again, a few years ago, this related primarily to governance developments or governance structure. And based on that, we actually made a number of changes in our governance policies and procedures. We moved from a triennial to an annual say on pay, just based on what investors were saying, even though we had received shareholder approval for a triennial vote. We were an early adopter of some proxy access. So we use this to inform how we think about our policies and practices. And what we've done now is we've gotten a better understanding of who the right people are at some of our investors. So we do have this standalone ESG engagement program that I oversee, but I've got wonderful partners that participate in it, where we will do an actual outreach to our top 50 institutional holders, usually after we file our third quarter 10Q, so that if financial issues or discussions do come up, we can address them. But it's, hey, proxy season's coming up. We want to start thinking about what we should be disclosing, what we should be talking about, what we may need to be doing. Not a financial discussion at all, but let us know if you want to get on the phone, if you want to complain or compliment us or just talk. And over the last 3 years, the number of acceptances to those invitations has gone up significantly. And like I said earlier, the topics that are front of mind have changed. For us specifically, early this year, we put out some new medium and long-term sustainability targets. That was a topic that was of import to investors last year, and we thought about it and said, okay, it's time to sharpen our pencils and put something out. DE&I is a big component of it as well, but this really is separate from our, call it, typical institutional engagement, where the IR teams either get on the phone or get on the road and go visit people, talk about the model, talk about results. What's been so great from my perspective is our head of IR has really has acknowledged and accepted that ESG issues are important. That's not always easy for an IR person to do. They've kind of embraced this program. They participate in it now. We have someone on the phone because what we found is investors like it. They like to see and hear from different experts at the company. They really feel like we're paying attention to them when we have someone from our sustainability group, from DE&I, from IR, from executive comp. We get good feedback in terms of, wow, you guys take this seriously. And when we take these issues to the board and we make changes, or don't, but can tell investors, yeah, we discussed it, here's why, we generally get good feedback from that.
Yep. I think the only thing I will add to that, because Neil, I think everything you've described has been our experience as well. I think we have a robust outreach program that we partner with IR, they do their own thing, and then we sort of have a separate outreach to the voting side or the investment stewardship group, depending on whether it's an active or a passive investor. But one thing that we do, and we had a challenge in 2017 to our compensation program and some suggestions to vote against our directors. We actually started bringing our independent directors into engagements with our top holders. And we have found that, in fact, to be a terrific opportunity for those board members to hear directly from our largest shareholders. And I think that relationship building has been terrific, has paid off And, bringing this back to the panel before us, and I know we're about at time, you don't want the first outreach to these folks to be when your hair is on fire. So building those relationships when the sky is blue, or, maybe there's a storm cloud approaching, but it's not right over your head, is terrific, because you want to be able to have that engagement when the time comes. If there is an emergency, you want to know who it is you can get on the phone. It's ideal if your independent director knows your contact at Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street, and they might even be on a first name basis, because that will help. It's not going to change. The investor is going to do what the investor is going to do, but it facilitates that conversation and hopefully gives the investor some perspective. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Mark, because I see we're out of time.
And I don't think we could end it on any better of a note. So I think that was perfect. And just thank you, everyone. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you for having me. And I will quickly turn it over to Sterling. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. I like how Laura tied both sessions together very nicely. Thanks, Neil, Amisha, Laura, Mark. I appreciate it. Great presentation. With that, we will conclude for an hour break, and we will come back to finish up the CLE at 3 to 5. So with that, we will see you at 3 p.m. Thanks. Hello, welcome back to the final two sessions of this CLE. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Bill Zarotny at Jones Day to dive into a discussion of developments and mergers and acquisitions. Bill?
Thanks, Sterling, and thanks, Lynette, for having us here today. We really appreciate it. There's been a lot of really great panels before us, and hopefully this one will be just as interesting. I'd like to start by having my colleagues introduce themselves. Darcy.
Hi, I'm Darcy White. I'm an M&A partner here at Jones Day in Atlanta.
And hey, everyone, I'm Michael Green. I'm an associate here in the M&A group at Jones Day.
And I'm Bill Zarotny, M&A attorney here at Jones Day for quite some time now. So we're gonna do a couple of things here. We're gonna talk a little bit about the year in M&A and look forward a little bit into next year. That's just gonna be a bunch of numbers, and we'll go through those slides fairly quickly. And then we'll talk about recent developments in mergers and acquisitions. Again, like one of the previous panelists said, it's a Friday afternoon, so we're not going to go through every single one of these slides. We'll hit the high points, talk about some of the interesting things, and let you guys read the rest of the slides on your own. Starting with some numbers. As everyone probably knows by now, this has been the busiest year in M&A history. Through the first 3 quarters, we've already broken all other annual records of M&A globally. Many people ask, why is that the case? Why is 2021 this kind of year? There's a combination of factors: low interest rates, an abundance of cash, because there weren't many deals done last year, as we all saw. There's some tax uncertainty around what future tax laws are going to look like. So a lot of companies are rushing to get deals done prior to any new tax developments. But at the end of the day, what it's led to is $4.4 trillion of deals in the first 9 months. As I said, that's broken all records. It doesn't seem to be slowing down anytime soon. On this slide, you can see the breakdown between the Americas, Europe, Asia Pacific. It's up across the board. It's not just the United States or Americas thing. By the number of worldwide deals globally, we're up 28% since last year. And value is up 92% from last year. This is an interesting slide because this is the number of large deals. And when you look at this, you'll see that deals in the $5 to $10 billion range have doubled year over year. That is, again, an all-time high, that's going to be a theme we're going to keep hearing me say here, all-time high across the board. And it's interesting that when we talk a little bit later about some regulatory issues, specifically around antitrust, one of the concerns M&A practitioners have is, the antitrust authorities are going to try to cool down this deal flow through regulatory actions, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. Private equity deals. So private equity deals, yes, at an all-time high, and have doubled again year over year, more than doubled year over year. And interestingly, private equity activity is 19% of all M&A activity so far this year. Again, also a record. I'm going to keep sounding like a broken record here because that is the trend. That is what 2021 has been. And those of you that have done any M&A this year, I'm sure you're looking forward to the time where things slow down just a little bit and we get to, my wife will remember what I look like. For US deal flow, it's been the same thing across the board. You see the breakdown in the upper right of what industries have been impacted the most. Obviously, technology has been the big one. The financial industry has been also booming. Now, while the numbers for healthcare don't seem as big by comparison, they are incredibly large from a year-to-year activity. So healthcare M&A has continued to rise rapidly. So what does this mean for next year? Well, I don't think I've come across any practitioner who thinks that January 1st is going to spell the end to what we're seeing here. It's very likely this trend will continue at least through the first half of next year. As most practitioners know, an election cycle tends to slow things down just a little bit. So maybe as we go into the mid-cycle elections next year, we'll see a little bit of dropping off. But as of now, I think everyone here would agree that the pipeline continues to be full, and there's no end in sight to what's going on. So we're gonna touch on these general topics and trends. We're gonna talk a little bit about data privacy, some antitrust discussion. There was some great presentation earlier today on ESG, so we're gonna talk about that a little bit in the context of M&A. We're gonna talk about walkaway deals and some rep and warranty updates, and we probably won't get to the SPACs, which that will not disappoint anybody on this call, because I'm sure that's all everyone has heard about is SPACs all year. But if we do have time at the end and there's no questions popping up, we might touch on that, but I don't think we'll get to it. Darcy.
Great. Yeah. So I am going to take over and talk a little bit about cybersecurity and data privacy concerns in M&A transactions. So, I won't rehash a lot of the specifics about data privacy and cybersecurity that other panelists have covered very well. But these are hot topics, and they're the focus of risk mitigation, both in legal firms and in legal departments. And so it's not surprising because at the end of the day, M&A is really about risk mitigation that we're focused on. It's not surprising that we're focused on these same sorts of issues that businesses are focused on generally in their day-to-day. So we'll talk a good bit today also about what we're looking at when we're looking at targets, but understand that if you find yourself as a target of an M&A transaction, everything that we're saying will apply just coming from the other direction. So want to start the conversation with a reminder about a bit of a cautionary tale from 2016, and that was the acquisition by Verizon of Yahoo. It was announced in 2016, mid-2016. And shortly thereafter, it was revealed that Yahoo had two pretty significant cyber breaches or data privacy breaches in 2013 and 2014. Of course, drama ensued, material adverse changes were alleged, and there were a lot of discussions about what would happen and whether the deal would go forward at all. After much discussion, the parties agreed to a significant purchase price cut, but then also maybe more importantly, the sellers had to agree to cover half of the liability of those data breaches going forward. So, I think no one would doubt that it almost killed the deal to have these breaches get revealed, especially in the way that they did. But then, it also put a really big hitch in the plans of Verizon for integrating Yahoo in and sort of being able to execute on their post-transaction integration and performance plans. Having that kind of a breach, and especially announced in the way that it was, led to some questions about confidence in both the target and Verizon as a result. And so that's why we're so focused, or it's just a good example of why we're so focused on these types of issues in M&A transactions. So what are the tools that we're dealing with when we're looking at these types of issues in an M&A transaction? Not surprisingly, it's the tools that we usually have in our tool belt. It's asking questions and diligence request lists. It's interviewing the right people internally that have the knowledge of the operations of the target around these areas. And then finally, if there's a big enough exposure, if there's a particular issue that's been identified, you might bring in a third party to help go through and assess the risk a bit more fully.
As a funny story, a few years ago, we were doing a buy-side deal and a client was visiting the target company's site. And while they were at the client company's site, there had been a breach.
Yeah.
And our clients were on the target company's network doing due diligence in their offices
Wow.
when there was a breach, and our client's laptop also got exposed. And we didn't find out about it until after they got back to their headquarters and tried to log back on into their system, which identified it. So it's a big threat.
Yeah, absolutely. And increasing, right? And so that's why we're focused on it. And so you're trying to sort of assess out what the target has in place. And it's what kind of data management systems and inventory systems that they have in place. You want to understand and know that the target has an understanding of the types and volume of data that they're dealing with, or particularly if you're dealing with sensitive stuff like healthcare information or personally identifiable information. Obviously, something you're going to want to focus on sooner rather than later. The sources of the data, where it's coming from, employees, consumers, customers, and whether that source of data has any specific requirements with respect to the data that was provided. How the data is collected and handled, where it's stored and processed, how it's shared and transferred, and particularly focusing on whether that data is crossing borders. Because it can certainly change the whole tenor of what you have to do with that data if that's the case. You want to know that they have a good data retention policy, and again, that they have a good classification of what they have, and know how to treat each one of those bits of data. What you're looking for, as with many types of M&A diligence exercises, is that the client is thoughtfully understands their legal exposure, has thought of a plan and put it in place, and they're doing what they need to do to comply with it. And so if they don't have these types of plans in place and haven't done this work, then it's likely going to be a red flag in our diligence report. So a little bit more about what you're looking for in the diligence exercise on cybersecurity and data privacy. You want to know what their privacy policies are internally and externally, and how they've changed over the years and why they've changed over the years, probably because they had a breach while they were in the middle of a diligence exercise with a potential buyer. Data protection policies about retention and disposal, and then how they are if they have a plan to respond to breaches and other incidents. Again, going back to the Yahoo cautionary tale there. Security controls, you want to understand what they have in place, and that's administrative controls to include to maintain internal security, physical safeguards to protect against physical threats, and technical safeguards to protect data and systems, and that's access controls, authentication measures, et cetera. And then you can understand what the target has in place, obviously, but it's key to understand how they're actually putting it into practice. I think there's a great quote from Mike Tyson that I love that says, he said, look, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And so you want to know what the target's done when they've gotten punched in the mouth, and otherwise how they've reacted and how they've complied. Also looking at who's in charge, or likely going to be interviewing that person per the earlier statement to understand, how they're running that part of the organization and that part of the business. And if there's no one in that position, it may be a red flag. And then you also want to understand how the target is auditing themselves, making sure that they're complying with the plan that they have in place. And finally, you're looking at past and present and threatened breaches and security incidents, and pending litigation and complaints and investigations, and any issues with respect to entities that they may have acquired, or any service providers that have been assisting them. And so, obviously, as buyer's counsel, you'd immediately prioritize anything that's unresolved. But also importantly, to understand kind of any settlement agreements that have been entered into, or orders that the target might be subject to, because that can have a significant impact on how businesses can operate going forward, which obviously at the end of the day, that's what a buyer is concerned about, being able to operate the business in a profitable way and to have the expectations met. So quickly, I won't say much about the different types of cybersecurity and data privacy regulations that are out there. Suffice it to say, it's a patchwork. It's federal, it's state, it's also industry standards, and potentially subject to self-regulatory guidelines. And so it's just a matter of understanding what applies to any given target, sort of given where they are and what they do. And then, so what happens once you've done this diligence and you kind of understand the risks that face the target? How does a buyer protect themselves? Probably the first and best line of defense is to have a robust set of reps and warranties that are tailored to the business that the target's in, and addresses any kind of specific concerns or specific things that are attributable to the target. So that can cover you on the unknown. There will often be known issues that you define, that you uncover during the diligence process, especially those that might be disclosed against on a set of disclosure schedules. And likely you're going to be negotiating a specific indemnity to cover the buyer's exposure on that going forward, assuming, of course, you have the leverage to do so, which isn't always the case these days, given the hot seller focused market. And then, so obviously there's also the consideration of what happens between signing and closing, because there may be issues that have been identified that can certainly be fixed by covenants that have a target do something between signing and closing that leaves you with less of a risk as a buyer from day one.
You brought up a great point. As Michael will tell us about a little bit later, with all these zero indemnification deals and walkaway deals,
right,
when you get in a situation where you've identified known data privacy issues or cybersecurity issues, and you have no remedy, and you're trying to negotiate the deal, oftentimes the client will say, well, we'll close the deal and we'll deal with that afterwards.
And that may be something that gets done, right? But
or not,
right? But part of obviously part of diligence is understanding where the exposures are and trying to get coverage for it. But then also it's understanding where the issues are and figuring out whether that works within the financial model, right, for going forward. So I think that is it, and I will turn it back over to you, Bill, for antitrust policy.
Slide going here. Uh-oh.
No, gosh.
What happened there? There we go.
Right.
Well
done.
Technical snafu there. Okay, so clearly anyone who's been watching the news knows that it's a new era of antitrust policy. Everything has changed in the past 12 months, and by everything, I mean everything. This would be a perfect place for one of those slides, and I wish I had it with all the headlines of all the things that have happened in the past several months from an antitrust perspective. Yeah. The lower left of the slide where it says there's been an increase in antitrust investigations. That is such an understatement, because you don't even see a large deal now where a large deal gets announced and a few days later you see a headline that says DOJ or FTC is going to take a closer look at that deal. It's just happening over and over. And it sort of changes the way we're looking at transactions, because in the old days, we would break down our transactions between, is this reportable, is it not reportable? If it wasn't reportable, we would just trudge ahead and not have to worry about anything. If it was reportable, we'd say, well, what are the chances that there's going to be a closer look at this particular transaction? Probably pretty slim. So we'll be able to get early termination and we'll get the deal done in a few weeks and we just move on our way. We don't have any of those discussions now. Now it's, okay, there's a risk to every single deal we're doing, whether or not we want to accept that at the beginning or not. There's risk to every deal, and it's just a matter of figuring out, is that a risk that's going to go beyond 30 days or what's coming. Secondly, there are stiffer penalties for violations, and there's discussions throughout FTC and DOJ about continuing to expand stiffer penalties for violations. We'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. There's been more burdensome merger reviews, so they've gotten rid of the suspended early termination. So those of you that don't do deals know that you would close your deal. You would sign your deal and then you would apply for early termination. And hopefully at some point in the next 30 days, you would get a letter from the government saying that they're terminating the review and you can go ahead and close, and we would get our deals closed. If you didn't hear from the government on day 30, you would be cleared to go ahead and close your deal. Interestingly, several months ago, they said when they said they were no longer doing early termination, they sent out a letter, or they have started sending out letters to people who were announcing deals that it's the tone of that letter, I would say, is
proceed at your own risk.
yeah, basically proceed at your own risk. And it said something to the effect in the last couple sentences about, those people who want to, do deals in a, a fair and balanced way, something will have no problem, waiting a little bit longer. It was a very harsh letter. But that's the new era that we're in. And we'll talk a little bit more about that last point in a minute. So one of the interesting things the FTC did back in July was the whole prior approval. They revived the prior approval clause, which I'd maybe seen one time in my entire career, and now it's come back. And it basically says that in connection with any FTC merger settlement, there's language that says the FTC is going to have the right to look at future transactions, usually for a period of 10 years. So you would have to give prior notice to the FTC whether or not your deal meets the reporting threshold. You have to give prior notice to the FTC.
Every deal.
Yeah, every deal. And the FTC has full authority, sole discretion to reject any planned transaction down the road that comes up, usually within a 10-year window. And it's interesting, the FTC's part of their reason for doing that was, a company going into a transaction that they know might have some level of minimal divestitures was just part of deal planning, right? It wasn't, acquirers weren't looking at it from an overall antitrust perspective. They were saying, okay, we want to do this deal. We might have to carve out this little business or this little business, but it was all part of the risk they were willing to do to get a deal done. And the FTC doesn't like that way of looking at deals. They want to stop them in their tracks. So this concept of again, I'm not an antitrust lawyer, but the concept of facially anti-competitive, because I wanted to actually get that out of the way here. I'm an M&A guy, I'm not an antitrust guy, but we're having to deal with more antitrust stuff in every single deal. So we're starting to turn a little more into antitrust people, or spend more time with our antitrust people. But basically what the government is saying now, that, well, the dissenters believe that they're trying to chill deal activity. And if you're a bit of a cynic, you would say that this is exactly what's taking place here. But really, they're trying to look at deals. They're trying to slow down deals that are on their face anti-competitive, but people are still trying to get done to get, if you're buying 100% of a company and at post divestiture, you're still going to get 80% of that company, and that's going to add quite a bit of value to your company. You're willing to take the risk, lose the other 20% in a divestiture, and sort of move on with that. And they're trying to do away with that type of analysis. So then the question is, well, what does that do? How do clients start to look at deals that have this new forward-looking antitrust aspect to it? And the one concern is, if you're going to do a divestiture in a transaction that has this 10-year forward-looking clause attached to it, then the buyer of your divested asset is also going to be subject to that 10 years. That asset stays under the 10-year pre-approval clause. It gets purchased by the divestiture buyer, and now they're also subject to the exact same, and that's going to have a dramatic chilling effect on these antitrust divestiture deals that we do.
Right, and there's just little recourse for.
Yeah, there's nothing.
It's just that the FTC can say that they want to do this, and you don't really have a whole lot. Whereas you would typically have, under an HSR process, you would have the ability to litigate. That's not the same.
Yeah, this is it. They have sole authority. There's no recourse. They've also, the FTC also withdrew its vertical merger guidelines earlier this year. And that was pretty controversial, seeing as how they just went into effect in 2020. And the concept here is that, there are a certain number of vertical mergers that are, they're not the position was they were not anti-competitive because they were up and down the supply chain. They were, you're requiring either suppliers or customers, and it did not have an effect on the overall monopolistic, it didn't affect the market share of the transaction. It affected so some guidelines were put in place to allow you to do these vertical mergers with minimum risk. So all of those were taken away based on the concept that they included unsound economic theories, and they're unsupported by law, unsupported by market realities. So the government's taking a different look at the new vertical merger guidelines, and they're hopefully going to come out at some point next year, and we'll get a better sense of the direction that's going. The size of transaction threshold went up to 92 million earlier this year. And outside of antitrust, just a quick little sampling of other regulatory developments that are happening that have been affecting M&A this year. The DOL has started recognizing the role of ESG integration in ERISA plans. That has caused us from a diligence perspective to look at ERISA plans in an entirely different manner, which has, again, become more of an educational process and has slowed things down just a little bit. As I said earlier, the DOJ suspended early terminations. From a tax perspective, with this new proposed global corporate minimum tax, it really changes the way we look at and structure transaction, particularly cross-border transactions. The tax planning that we used to do is being approached from an entirely different perspective. And again, because it hasn't been enacted yet, every transaction that we do that has a longer time frame has us looking at deals from both perspectives. If this goes forward, if it doesn't go forward, how do we structure it differently? Do we want to do the deal? And then from an overall executive branch perspective, companies are being ordered to mitigate all climate-related financial risks, and that is a broad area that I know we in our earlier presentation today around regulatory things, there was some climate-related, environmental-related stuff that went into that a little bit deeper. But the bottom line is, it's been a year of additional regulatory action by the government. Has not chilled M&A much this year, but might look moving forward.
Great. So that's actually the environmental bit is a good segue to the next slide the next section, talking about ESG issues. The other panel covered this expertly, and some of this will be a little bit of rehash. We'll try to minimize that as much as possible. But, as I said earlier, as M&A practitioners and as our clients are looking at deals, they're looking at sort of all of the risks that are attendant to any business out there. And ESG has certainly been at the forefront in the last years and shows no signs of slowing down. So, environmental, social, and governance issues, it's something that we're adding to the list now of what we're looking at when we're looking at targets. It's a useful tool to sharpen focus on value orientation and risk management, and understanding sort of how a target is thinking through these issues, environmental concerns, planning for net zero operations, understanding societal concerns around equal opportunity and social justice. And I guess at the end of the day, the idea is that every company has a role to play, and you want to understand what a target has sort of looked at and decided for itself, and that they have a thoughtful approach to addressing these concerns, which are concerns of multiple investors across the spectrum. So, again, won't go back and rehash the ground that's already been very well covered, but suffice it to say that institutional investors and investors across the board, or from BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, are all very focused on ESG, and including board and larger employee group diversity, mandating that companies understand the potential risks attendant to environmental change, and that they have a plan in place to both counteract that risk, but also to mitigate their impact on that climate change. These investors are using their bully pulpit and their vote to try to prompt change. And it's not just change for change's sake. I think they do honestly see this as a potential risk to the bottom line for many companies. And so again, it goes back to risk mitigation, and that's why we're talking about it and looking at it. Activist investors are continuing to ratchet up the pressure with shareholder proposals. And at the end of the day, there's just, as this chart shows, the amount of funds flowing into ESG focused investments is going up substantially, and it's leveled off a bit, but we think that trend will certainly continue. Obviously, regulatory changes in the ESG space, they're coming, they will continue to come. Won't go into great detail here, but suffice it to say, including as the political ground shifts, both here and abroad, we'll be, dealing with new changes in the regulatory framework and have to keep up. So what does that mean, when we're talking about M&A deals, which is what we're talking about here today? We, are looking at kind of what the targets are doing, whether they have thoughtfully gone through and identified how they would mitigate ESG risks. Again, and this is again a theme that we'll go back to. Yeah, if they've identified the risks and they put a plan in place, are they then living the plan, and are they monitoring how well they're living the plan? And so ultimately, the issue is whether they are doing what they say that they're going to do, and that can cut down the risk of exposure on claims for any number of claims related to failure to live up to the plan that they have in place.
So have either of you done any deals where the client has asked you on a buy side perspective to focus on any particular ESG issues, or has this come up mainly as just another category of stuff that we've been working on?
I think it's a particular focus on the societal part, and the increased number of employment discrimination related claims, harassment related claims, which kind of bridges the S and the G. But yes, I think there is that increased focus on those areas because it's increased for exposure for litigation.
Yeah, and my experience not on the buy side per se, but on the sell side in a public company transaction, we saw the buyer was sort of hyper focused on it, asked a lot of questions because it's a big piece of their approach.
That's
So,
right.
So
It's about integration, right? Like you want to be sure that whatever the plan is in place, when that entity is integrated into the buyer, that the plans are aligned, and
And that's actually a great point.
Is necessary.
Yeah, so I think that's the bifurcation I've seen. So on public company deals, it's often front and center, a lead point.
Right.
It comes up in all
Fair
discussions.
point. Yep.
A lot of the private company deals I've done, it's on a due diligence checklist somewhere, but it's not coming up in a lot of meetings. It's not as actively discussed, but yeah, definitely in every public company deal, it's
sure
front and center.
for sure.
All right, so I think we will take it over to Michael.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the growth we've seen in zero indemnity or seller walk away, or sometimes called no survival deals over the last couple of years. And I'd say this has really picked up steam. It was moving forward before the kind of COVID M&A freeze, but I think since that freeze thaw, we've really seen this become pretty prevalent. I mean, almost the norm in auction processes, I would say.
Yeah.
If there's competition for business, you can expect to see this approach proposed. Just to talk a little bit about where we were and where we've come on recourse against sellers. 7 or 8 years ago, doing deals, at least in the US, like rep and warranty insurance was sort of a novel product, and you didn't see a lot of buyers buying rep and warranty insurance. So you still saw significant transactions done with full seller indemnities for breaches of reps and warranties and covenants, with the pages and pages of procedures and limitations, et cetera. And then kind of the next evolution of that was a more broad adoption of rep and warranty insurance. And you saw sellers sort of take on a piece of the exposure, if you will. They'd sort of split, what's called the retention under the rep and warranty policy. And that became sort of the prevalent approach in auctions. And now we've sort of taken the next step. And this next step is, now no representations and warranties survive the closing. Often the pre-closing covenants don't survive the closing. And the buyer's sole recourse, except in really, really limited circumstances, is the rep and warranty insurance policy. And so I'm talking about this in terms of rep and warranty insurance policies, but also keep in mind that there are corporates out there who are sort of insurance averse or risk tolerant, if you will. And in really competitive auction situations, we have seen corporate buyers step up and do these deals without any policy. Mm-hmm. Particularly in deals with a lot of competition, companies with strong operational track records, audited financial statements. We are seeing that some.
And I think, so how do you think that has affected the due diligence process?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of interesting. Like the due diligence process has changed a lot because of rep and warranty insurance to me. I would say that we're doing more robust diligence, particularly where somebody's not buying a policy, but sort of the way that we tiptoe around risks now due to the potential for exclusions under rep and warranty insurance policies has really changed.
Yeah, and I think we've seen a lot more especially this year, a lot more sort of go, no-go decisions earlier on in the due diligence process, where
sure.
if you know it's going to be a walkaway deal and you're going to be shouldering an unbearable amount of risk, I see a lot of our buy-side clients making decisions much earlier in the process.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And even though we talk about these being, no survival or walk away deals, there are still deals that we're doing without sort of fulsome indemnification for breaches of reps that do involve some indemnity aspects. And one way to do that is, to ask for an indemnity for fundamental reps. And the buyer can kind of use that to fill the gaps in their insurance policy. Sometimes you just see, the fundamental reps and warranties survive, but no indemnity. So there's potential to make a breach of contract claim. And we still are seeing, although, depending on the issues, we still are seeing, specific indemnities for known things that rep and warranty insurance is going to exclude. And I think another big change over the last couple of years have been there's no sort of fulsome pre-closing tax indemnity in a lot of these deals. The rep and warranty insurance policies now can contain, synthetic tax indemnities that cover unknown taxes that come up in the future. And we do still see sellers willing to pay, the pre-closing portion of taxes that show up on kind of ordinary course tax returns. So that's a huge change. A couple of potential, pitfalls or cracks in the structure that we'll talk about a little bit are purchase price adjustment mechanisms and fraud carve-outs. So the purchase price adjustment mechanism, if you are a seller looking to walk away on a deal and have no tail liability, this is one place that you really need to have your eyes on. What you really don't want is for a buyer to use this post-closing adjustment mechanism as a backdoor way to make claims against you about the accuracy of the financial statements. And there has been some fairly interesting litigation on this over the last, well, this case is about 5 years old, but this case cited here, the Chicago Bridge case. I won't go into a ton of detail on it, but it involved a purchase price dispute that essentially gobbled the entire purchase price. And the actual dispute between the parties was around how much authority the accounting referee had to interpret the accounting principles and reconcile them to GAAP. And as a result of that case, there's now this pretty interesting and relatively common language that I'll flash up here on the page that we certainly try to put in for seller clients, and typically I see buyers accept this actually. And the purpose of this is to say that the post-closing purchase price adjustment mechanism, it's not intended to adjust for errors in the financial statements or to reconcile the financial statements, the accounting policies and GAAP to one another. And it clarifies that the rep and warranty insurance policy is your recourse for breaches of the financial statements reps. And just one other thing on purchase price adjustments, I think we sort of commonly see that the definitions in the purchase agreement of net working capital, debt, and the accounting principles is something that tends to get kind of punted down the road and saved until last at times. And this is really one of the few places that a seller can have exposure in one of these no survival deals. It's really important to make sure, early in the process that you have the external accountants, corporate accounting, the finance team, and external counsel all kind of aligned and working on this stuff to make sure it all lines up.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I've had 2 a.m. calls to go through accounting principles because people
Right,
focus on it
end.
at the very last minute. Exactly.
Right, everybody thinks
and
the
it's
deal
both
is done.
sides, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And everyone's like, wait, where's Exhibit C?
Yes.
Accounting principle. Where's
Yeah.
Exhibit? Oh, we'll get
Yeah.
to that. We'll get to that. We'll get to that. Hey, we're trying to sign the deal.
That's exactly right. Fraud carve-outs. So fraud carve-outs are not unique to no survival or seller walkaway deals, if you will. But the way that fraud carve-outs operate in these transactions has changed a little bit. We used to see fraud carve-outs show up in your indemnity limitations and in your exclusive remedy provision. Now this sort of tends to show up in two places. One is you'll have a survival provision that says the reps and warranties don't survive, and there is usually a statement, but this doesn't preclude claims for fraud based on those reps and warranties. And then the other is subrogation under the representation of warranty insurance policy. I guess to talk a little bit about Delaware law on fraud, which is obviously Delaware is where most major transactions get done, or at least a large portion of them. Delaware allows the parties to disclaim and essentially get rid of claims for fraud based on reps made outside the agreement. But the law in Delaware is that parties can't disclaim claims for actual fraud based on reps in the agreement. So as a seller, when you're constructing these fraud carve-outs, you want to be as careful as possible to stick to that strict construction under Delaware law. You want actual fraud based on reps made in the agreement. And as a buyer, you're going to propose lowercase f fraud, and you want as broad a remedies as you can, and you may throw a willful misconduct in there. Why not, right? So a couple of definitions of fraud here. This is a pretty good definition of fraud from a seller perspective, right? This is actual and intentional fraud. So you're eliminating concepts like constructive fraud or promissory fraud, or any kind of fraud based on reckless disregard for the truth. It's limited to reps in the agreement and the ancillary agreements. This is an even better definition of fraud from a seller perspective, right? This actually recites the elements of fraud. It requires actual knowledge and specific intent to deceive. And you also have this helpful disclaimer or carve out language at the end that gets rid of equitable, constructive, promissory, unfair dealings fraud.
And recklessness.
Yes.
And recklessness. And recklessness.
These carve out recklessness. So okay. So
sorry, I don't.
So Darcy, so in your experience, you've done a lot of deals in your career. How many deals have had post-closing fraud claims that you've worked?
Well, I mean, it's the kitchen sink, right? Every time there's an indemnity claim, almost they're going to throw in fraud, whether or not they're going to be able to make it or not. Have I seen any successful ones? No, I came close once, but no. But no.
One successful one.
Did you? That's impressive.
Yeah.
Were you on the which side?
We were on the
of
good
that were
side.
you
Yeah,
on?
we
Oh, good.
were
You're on the side of the
receiving
right.
numbers. Yeah,
Okay,
we were on the
that's
good side.
great.
We were on
Yeah,
the non-fraud committing side, of course.
perfect. And I think the other thing to note here too is when you're talking about the fraud definitions, you also want to be sure you're carefully knitting that together with the non-reliance provisions in the agreement. So you want to have the seller say, hey, these are all the reps and warranties that we've given. But then you also need to have the buyer correspondingly say, yes, we understand that these are all the reps and warranties that we're getting, the ones that are in this agreement. So there's no daylight.
What about all those things the seller says at dinner? About all the big new customers that are coming in and these new products they have coming through R&D. Yeah.
And then I mentioned kind of the other function of fraud carve-outs, and that it plays into the subrogation provisions and the rep and warranty insurance policy. A lot of times sellers will put a covenant in the purchase agreement that says, hey, buyer, your rep and warranty policy will provide that the insurer can only subrogate against us in the case of fraud. So this definition of fraud becomes sort of important to staving off any claims by rep and warranty insurers.
That's right. And that's why you also push back when a buyer tells you don't need to look at the reps and warranties insurance policy.
Exactly.
Like, au contraire.
Even as a seller, always look at the rep and warranty insurance policy. And crazy enough, I've had as good of fights with carriers on the sell side as I have on the buy side about that. I don't know if y'all have had similar experience.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And they're intractable, and I guess at the end of the day, they'll sue you for whatever you want, for whatever they want to. But it's helpful to have tight language to point out on subrogation.
That's right.
Great point.
So
speaking of rep and warranty
insurance, so obviously we just talked a good bit about rep and warranty insurance, but a little section here on kind of some market trends and updates. As Bill talked about, the M&A market's been absolutely gangbusters, and what that's led to is crazy high demand for rep and warranty insurance policies. The market's really so busy that sometimes you're getting brokers say, you got to get started on this early because underwriting teams just aren't available. The underwriters are demanding additional time to schedule calls and arrange for more diligence. And you'll also see them, provide a non-binding indication and request that you turn it around really, really quickly. They're just not letting things even hang out there anymore. From a rate perspective, rates have gone up. Just probably last year, you could expect 3 to 4% of policy limits to be your typical premium. Now we're seeing 3.5 to 6%. And that's even on clean deals, on small deals, and on deals with, hair on them, if you will. We're seeing a lot of carriers just pass completely.
So interesting. So going back to this rate thing. So it's funny because at the beginning of this year, rates were so much lower, and we were getting calls from all the time from all these business development calls. Hey, do you have any clients doing deals? We'd love to insure your deals. Get to the end of the year, and you call up those same people saying, hey, I got a great deal for you here. Yeah, no, I don't think we can do it. If we're going to do it, it's going to be super expensive. And so wait a minute, back in January, when you were calling me to go have drinks, you were super interested in insuring all my deals, and now you don't want to do any of them. It's you can't even begin to describe how the entire world has been flipped over just since between January and now.
Yeah.
That's right. Now they want the big deal. That's a clean deal.
Yeah.
That has plenty of time for them to underwrite.
Exactly.
Which is sort of no deal.
It's
which
the
is everybody
unicorn.
knows.
Exactly. There's no such thing.
Right. So the retentions under policies, I mentioned the retentions earlier. This is the deductible, if you will. This is the amount of losses that have to be incurred before the policy kicks in. Retentions are really kind of stabilized around 1% being typical. You can expect to see a drop down to 0.5% after 12 months. And those are percentages of enterprise value, by the way. One other thing to note on retentions, we talked a lot about no seller retention or no surviving deals a bit ago. The carriers are doing a ton of those now. It used to be that they sort of expected to see the seller have some skin in the game for moral hazard reasons. Obviously, they're not as concerned about that now, which has given rise to the prevalence of these deals. But you can expect an additional premium sometimes to do those.
I don't know if you guys have had the same experience, but some of my strategic clients still have a bit of heartburn, right, over having a strategic target have the ability to just kind of stick their head in the sand potentially and not have that sort of incentive to fully disclose.
Yeah, essentially, in the entire concept of moral hazard, it's funny you said that. It makes so much sense from like a rational perspective that in this market where you have so many buyers going after individual targets and these multiples that are off the charts that make no sense whatsoever, it's sometimes hard to counsel your client and explain to them that while morally the position you're taking
however
is absolutely true, and we completely agree with that. In this current environment, it just doesn't hold weight against these other folks that are willing to come in here and let people just take a pass on standing behind their reps.
That's right.
And it's similarly hard to tell a buyer, hey, actual fraud has become sort of the market standard for your post-closing recourse. So if this person is just recklessly lying to you, you shouldn't be worried about it, right?
Right.
It is kind of hard to swallow.
It is hard to swallow. Yeah.
But obviously we think very differently on the sell side.
but not only is it difficult to swallow, but the speed at which that has changed, I think, has been the interesting part, right?
For sure. I mean, it's definitely as the markets have swung.
Yeah,
this is swung.
We would not have been having this conversation. It would have been an entirely different conversation even a year ago. And now the whole world has changed, and it's hard to explain to clients. I mean, the numbers are one thing, or you can show charts, but to say the basic fundamental of somebody standing behind their company in a deal has disappeared, or is disappearing.
That's right.
For sure. And I wonder, is it going to? So the question is, when the deals slow down, is that going to turn around?
And then if they can't get the deal done with the buyer, they can just go SPAC, which we'll talk about if we have time, but we probably won't.
I hope we don't.
Yeah, exactly.
So deal size trends a little bit for rep and warranty policies. It's tough to buy a policy with a limit of less than $3 to $5 million. That kind of equates to a $30 to $50 million deal. You get below that, and it's hard to get much carrier interest, and it's just also sort of not economic. Really large deals are getting insured now. There have been deals over $10 billion in enterprise value being insured, and you usually see those done through a number of insurers under kind of a complex tower arrangement. As far as claims history goes, some 2019 data shows about 1 in every 5 policies experiences a claim, and that seems to be a little bit higher, more like 1 in 4 for deals between 500 million and $1 billion. Claim severity seems to have grown a little bit, and as far as we get buy-side clients ask us all the time, especially those who are new to buying these policies. Well, what's recovery history like? Like, are these folks going to stand behind this policy, when the rubber meets the road? And I think generally the consensus is they do. The amount of litigation we're trying to recover against rep and warranty insurers is pretty low. But they are insurance companies. They're kind of they're in the business of denying claims in a sense.
And another interesting thing, and just from a law firm perspective, is if you look back even 3 years ago, for example, at Jones Day, we have insurance practice and we have an insurance recovery practice, and we have folks who were broad insurance attorneys who could do D&O insurance claims, or warranty insurance claims, environmental policy. They recover. Now we have people in the firm who only do rep and warranty insurance, and that is,
and they're very good at it.
and that's all they do all day, every day, all night, it seems these days.
Yes.
And more and more firms are moving to that, to have people that can just focus on this, because they become so prevalent and complicated.
Yep.
It's become a huge practice.
Yes.
As far as who's using rep and warranty insurance now, it used to be thought of as a product for private equity sellers, or I should say that benefits private equity sellers, and that strategics usually weren't willing to buy. That's not really the case anymore. About 35% of policies placed are for strategics. Agreement comments, due to the crazy demand, we talked about higher premiums. The insurers are also being really, really aggressive on marking up the purchase agreement. And oftentimes you'll get in one of these non-binding indications back, and it will just have entire chunks of reps excluded. They have very, very aggressive standard exclusions now. And there's ample room to fight with them about it.
Yeah, that has definitely been a change. I mean, it used to be you would never get comments on the purchase agreement from that. Maybe if there's like a 10b5 rep, like you would get a comment on that, but outside that, they weren't going to push back on the purchase agreement. So
do you guys find yourself winning or losing these battles with these insurance companies on their changes to the document?
it depends on how bad the document was to begin with, right? But generally, they are being somewhat reasonable, right? And I think you can argue that the pendulum had sort of swung too far, because there were conversations like, hey, just give us the rep. You don't have to worry about it. The insurer is going to be the one that's on the hook. And so I think they've, gotten smart to that game, and they're just trying to bring the pendulum back a little bit. But at the end of the day, they still want to be able to write policies, and they still want people to come to them, so they can't be too obstructionist. At least that's been my experience.
Yeah, I think it's right. And it's interesting because there are some insurance companies that we sort of call that they're more commercial, right? That
That's
they're willing
true.
to work
That's
with you,
true.
and they're willing to understand the deal and the reps and the actual risks, and you can have intelligent conversations with them.
Right.
And then there are, still a handful of insurance companies that are very formulaic and
Right. Knee jerk on
Exactly.
exclusions. Like
Yes.
they just don't cover
yeah,
it.
we don't cover this,
Right,
and
right.
the rep has to say this, and we're just
Right.
not going to move. And it's interesting because we try very hard to steer our clients towards the more commercial insurance companies, so we can have intelligent conversations about this
Exactly.
particular deal, this particular risk, and these particular words on the paper.
That's right.
Absolutely. And then the last point on this slide, we obviously talked a lot about no survival deals, but I thought this was interesting that the carriers are estimating that 30 to 70% of the policies they're placed are no survival deals. So that tells you sort of how prevalent this walk away model has become.
Well, shockingly, we do have a little bit of time
Right.
left. I don't know if we have questions. Yeah. So just talking, and I will keep this very brief about SPACs. I mean, I know that we all know what SPACs are. This chart is a handy dandy reminder of how they work. A couple of sort of important parts of the SPAC. When the SPAC is formed and it IPOs, funds come into that SPAC, but those funds have to go back out and be for use of acquiring a target within a certain time period. And if they don't, the money has to be given back to investors. And so that's driving a lot of froth in the market as well. Right now, by some estimates, there are 500 SPACs out there looking for a deal, well over 100 billion in dry powder to be deployed. So it's obviously, again, driving some of the froth in the market. But I think the question here is whether SPACs are here to stay or if they're kind of yesterday's news. And consensus is really that they are here to stay. I think it's certainly become a fixture of financial news. You can't watch Squawk Box without hearing about some sort of a SPAC of the day. And it's actually highly recommend Googling a Bloomberg chart. It's a Venn diagram that shows the overlap between celebrity SPAC sponsors and celebrities who have an alcohol brand. And there's a pretty big middle of people that have both. And so I think that's some indication of how.
What does that tell you?
Right, exactly. It's some indication of how crazy this market is. But, whether or not, and I think that you can also think that SPACs, whether they're truly transformational or truly a good investment for folks is an open question. Sponsors are obviously making money, initial investors are obviously making money, but the SPACs themselves, by and large, outside of a few unicorns like DraftKings, are not doing as well as their IPO brethren. And so, there was actually an interesting UGA professor equated it to a quickie marriage in Vegas versus an engagement and well planned out wedding. Like both get you hitched, but the long-term value may well be in the one that was thought through more fully. But companies are still obviously drawn to the SPAC opportunity targets, especially targets that are emerging growth companies. Sometimes they're even non-revenue, but early stage companies often, and the SPAC is really, or the de-SPAC transaction, I should say, when they're merging with a SPAC, is an opportunity to leapfrog and sort of get out there and get publicity, obviously, get access to public markets. And it also offers kind of a full cash out like you wouldn't see on an IPO.
So dumb question. How does the public market value a non-revenue or pre-revenue company?
It's a great question, and there's smarter minds.
I know you don't have the answer to
that. Yeah, exactly.
Depends on how smart the sponsor is.
Exactly. I know that. However, the sponsor
very,
markets
very
it.
fair point. That's right. So it's still attractive, and like I said, I think that they're here to stay for those particular reasons. But the market's hot. But I think it will, whether it cools and how much it cools because of regulatory and litigation remains to be seen. And I think an interesting stat is in the first half of 2021, there were more class actions against SPACs than there were of all of 2020. So that's a trend that is likely to increase, and the SEC is obviously looking closely at SPACs. SPACs have been able to take advantage of the safe harbor for forward-looking statements like an IPO company would not. And I think there likely will be some change coming there as the SEC looks to say, look, this is really more akin to an IPO process. And so these SPACs shouldn't be able to take advantage of that forward-looking safe harbor, which also could cool the market a bit. But that's it on SPACs.
Well, that's all we got. So we'll hand it back over to Sterling. Nobody wants to look at my picture, so we'll hand it back over. Especially Sterling doesn't want to look at my picture, so we'll definitely hand it back over to Sterling.
Thanks, Bill, Darcy, and Michael. I appreciate it. Great presentation. And so we'll keep moving forward. We will come to our final presentation. And I think Anuj, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm
Great.
ready.
Okay, well, I will kick it to you to close us out then.
Awesome. Great. There's my cameras on. Let me share my screen. Let's see. Okay. Is everybody seeing my slide?
Yes, you're good to go.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. Well, good afternoon. It's Friday at 4 p.m. Nice time slot. And I'm what stands between you and the weekend. But I promise to make this interesting, useful, and exciting. If you want to grab a beer, I can't see you. So go ahead, grab some snacks, grab some popcorn, and let's get into it. So today we're talking about creative review. And for all of you in-house counsel that deal with IP issues from time to time, this presentation and the materials that I sent over earlier will be a great way to kind of keep a check on what's coming across your desk, what your business is putting out into the marketplace, and just make sure that you've got your eyes on the risks and some of the legal compliance issues that come up with creative assets. I start the presentation always with sort of this view that we need to keep in mind your overarching goal. And that goal is, meeting your company's business goals, but while minimizing legal and other risks. We don't want to be the no department. We don't want to be the maybe department. We want to show them how it's done, but at the same time, keep them out of trouble. And that's sort of the focus of the presentation. A couple definitions up there on the screen for those of you who don't deal with intellectual property all the time. It's a pretty broad term, covers a lot of different things, but today we're really going to be focused on copyrights, trademarks, and some related topics, not getting into everything else. But again, we are within the world of IP as we look at creative review. So what is creative review? It's a holistic review process of marketing and other assets by a company's legal team, by you. And the reason for it is to ensure compliance with trademark, copyright, advertising, and a variety of other laws and regulations. If you operate in fintech, you've got to worry about those laws. If you're in the utility space, natural gas, and so on, you've got other laws. But this that we're talking about here is more the IP space and things that you need to keep in mind as you do that holistic review. The other thing that creative review covers are those non-legal things that your company worries about. Is what we're putting out there in the marketplace, are those tweets and Instagram posts, are they aligned with our values or mission statement? Is it going to create a PR issue, which, everything goes viral these days, so something you worry about as well. A careful creative review process will help you keep a handle on those things and keep the risk level down while serving the business and what they want to do out there to market themselves. So let's look at a life cycle of the review process. Typically, and this is where some training may be needed for your company if the marketing and sales and other business units aren't attuned to sending you their legal materials, what they need to be trained to do is send their creative assets to the legal department. And creative assets means a variety of, photos, videos, marketing slicks, all sorts of things need to come through the legal team to ensure that you have the ability to review them, ensure they're legally compliant, minimize risk, and then send them out into the marketplace. And so as you look at the diagram there on your screen, you'll see that the creative assets are sent to the legal department. You, either yourself or with outside counsel like me, would review it. Comments are sent back, maybe iterative changes are made, and the cycle sort of continues until the creative asset is ready to be pushed out into the marketplace. And in my experience, the thing we see most often is that you all will get these requests like today on a rainy Friday afternoon with the comment that, hey, we're pushing this out on Monday. All's good, right? And all of a sudden you've got, the stress on your shoulders of trying to ensure that everything looks correct. You're afraid to push back because of the deadline, but sometimes you have to. So the tip there on the screen is your business really needs to know to involve you early. If they involve you early, if there's a deal breaker type of thing, then you can let them know ahead of time, and they can pivot and they can adapt to what needs to be done before the deadline involved. So some general do's and don'ts up here on the screen for the creative review process. And again, this presentation, a copy of what you have, is meant to be sort of a handy guide to keep nearby, save it to your desktop or a shared folder. So you can just refer to it from time to time. But these are just some of the do's and don'ts that typically come up in the creative review process that both you and your business should be mindful of. Again, if they're coming out with new product names, concepts, ad scripts, anything like that, to get it to you as early as possible so you have time to vet them. They shouldn't be going out into the marketplace without somebody in the legal team, and often that legal team is just one person, somebody in the legal team reviewing those materials. Talk to them about prioritizing, new brands or taglines. Sometimes they'll come up with 10 or 15, which can be very cumbersome, very expensive for you to review, maybe 2 or 3, and prioritizing. If you get the first one cleared, you don't have to review the other 2. At the same time, they can do their own diligence. They can get on Google, they can search other industry documents and materials and databases and see, somebody else already doing this. If so, we may want to stay away. And as we'll talk about a little later, pay careful attention to any quality claims, facts, figures, percentages in these creative materials, because those can set you up for a situation where you may or may not have substantiation. And if that's the case, where you don't have substantiation, you could be challenged by, for example, the FTC, the plaintiff's class action bar, a competitor, and so on. So again, keep these overall do's and don'ts in mind as you go through the creative review process. We'll start first with, trademarks. So in a nutshell, you hear the word brand. Brand is a trademark. And, one of the things a trademark does is it signifies the exclusive source of a product or service and distinguishes it from others in the marketplace. And so it's very important that we treat our trademarks correctly, and that we uphold them in all of the creative materials that we're putting out there. Trademarks can be in the form of words like King of Pops or Delta. As you can see there, they can be designs, words and designs. They can even be colors like the UPS brown. They can be sounds and costumes and smells and a whole lot of other things. And so, as we look at a trademark, let's say, again, thinking about creative assets that come to you, as we look as a trademark that might be pitched as something the company wants to put out, and it's coming across your desk, this screen here, this slide, is a good reference as to what I, as a trademark lawyer, would be looking at over the life cycle of a trademark. So first, obviously, a trademark is created. And when a trademark is created, the goal really is to create a strong trademark, because a strong trademark is, one, easy to protect, but 2, it also stands out in the marketplace, which at the end of the day is what you want for a brand. And so if we look at the screen, you've got there at the bottom sort of the spectrum of trademark strength. And if you take, for example, a pool chemical company that might be coming out with a new brand, at the very bottom, you'll see what's considered a descriptive trademark. Let's say, keep it clean, right? It's very descriptive. Your competitors probably use that phrase. It's not going to be a good trademark. It's going to be hard to register, hard to protect. Then we move a little bit up the spectrum and you'll see suggestive trademarks. And that could be, for example, sea blue, kind of like you see there on the screen. And again, this kind of suggests what the product will do, but isn't quite descriptive. And, often this is the middle ground that marketing and legal find, because marketing often wants descriptive terms to communicate what the product does. But the best would be, what's considered a fanciful or made up trademark. And here, for example, Masundo, which means nothing, it's something I made up. This would be a strong trademark because there'd be, hardly anything out there like it. So it'll stand out. It won't be confused with other brands. Or you can do something arbitrary, like grass. Grass has nothing to do with pool chemicals. And so again, you want to pick a strong type of trademark, fanciful or arbitrary, because it'll be memorable and it'll be easy to protect. So let's say your business comes to you with a good, strong trademark. You say, great, okay, we can move forward. The next step, would be to clear it. We want to clear it to avoid infringement with other marks, because the test is not, is it identical to another brand out there? The test is whether it's confusingly similar. So there can be subtle differences, but at the end of the day, a consumer might feel that these are the same brands or is reminding them of another brand. And if so, you might have a case of infringement. So Trademark Counsel will clear your brand for you, see if there's a risk of infringement. And again, clearance also helps deter confusion in the marketplace. We don't want our customers confusing our brands with others or being mistaken about, what is the source for this product. Clearance also sometimes identifies non-legal risks. So for example, if the brand you picked is tied to some cult leader somewhere, yeah, we don't want that baggage with our new brand. That's something we want to avoid. So clearance is an important step that we need to follow as well. And then after that, let's say we move forward with clearance, we want to control, right? So we want to control this brand. We want to obtain registration for it through the trademark office, whether in the US or abroad. And we want to enforce it. If somebody tries to copycat you or infringe the brand, you will have the obligation to go after them. And as your brand grows and does well, you might see complementary industries or product lines where you might want to license it to others. And so there's a variety of things to think about as trademarks come across your desk when you're doing creative review. And keep in mind, one thing that companies often do is they'll go ahead and launch a brand. They won't even tell you. And so a brand may already be in use, but it's still worthwhile to go through this process of clearance and control to make sure that you're not stepping into a landmine a year down the road. So on the trademark front, there's some do's and don'ts again on your screen. And one thing is proper trademark usage. We really want to use the trademark as an adjective or attributive modifier. And that's where the trademark will be followed by a generic term in the creative assets being put out by your company. We don't want to use a trademark as a noun. We don't want to equate the trademark with the thing itself, because over time, that could make your trademark generic. And if you think of things like, a Frisbee, well, Frisbee used to be a brand, but now it's just that disc that you throw around. And we don't want to use it as a verb either. We don't want to put it in the possessive form, apostrophe S, or make it plural. And we'll go through some examples in a second. The other thing is, we want to be careful about putting out creative assets that have third-party trademarks. Sometimes it's in passing or it's a reference to like a social media platform, which is okay. But if your company is mentioning a competitor, for example, that should send off warning bells, because then we need to be more careful about whether there's a basis to reference a third-party brand, or are we going to get an objection letter, cease and desist letter on the basis of infringement or false affiliation or something of that nature. So keep in mind the do's and don'ts. So let's look at some examples. You have there on your screen, Home Depot, that's what we call it, but the full brand is the Home Depot, which is registered. And so again, always try and use the complete brand. Try not to mutilate it or modify it, even inadvertently, because it can have downstream effects when you try and maintain your registrations and enforce your brand against others. In the middle there, we all say, Kleenex is a thing, Kleenexes, but that's the brand. We don't want to make it plural. So we would say Kleenex tissues instead, and that's the proper usage there. With Google, yes, everybody says Google this, Google that, using that as a verb. Of course, the Alphabet company hates that. It's a Google search, with Google bringing the trademark and search being, the service or the product that follows. So, just some pretty visible examples, the things to keep in mind as you go through and think about your own brands and what your company is putting out in the marketplace and how they treat those brands. Sort of related topic would be trademark symbols. It's not mandatory, but it is important to use them, especially once you get registrations to enforce your rights. And trademark symbols, sometimes, if you have a descriptive mark and you go ahead and put the little TM on there, it can actually help deter others from copying you, even if you have limited strength in your trademark. So keep that tip in mind as well. Often there's confusion that we see amongst the business. When can I use a R symbol? When can I use the TM symbol? And they feel that if they get a registration, they can always use the R symbol. It's actually tied to the specific goods or services you get a registration for. And so I would say, you want to advise the business, let's not use the symbols without thinking it through. There needs to be sort of a one-to-one match, especially with the registration symbol, to make sure that the registration covers the types of goods and services you're using the trademark with. So some more examples, use the TM symbol if the trademark is not registered, and use the R symbol if it is registered. You'll typically place these symbols superscripted, upper or lower right-hand corner of a trademark. And there's also some confusion. Do I have to use it every time? No, once at the most prominent first use of a trademark in a creative asset will be fine. But you don't have to use it at every mention of the mark, which I know marketing hates because it clutters up all of their creative assets. And social media platforms sometimes require a little loosening of the rules just because it's more of a conversational medium, and adding a bunch of symbols and legal lines and legalese can sometimes gum up the works. And so keep that in mind as well. And if you are one of those companies that licenses in brands from others, just keep in mind they may have their own requirements as part of the license. So do check that. Do ensure you're following their rules and that you're in compliance with the license overall. One other thing I wanted to mention briefly before we move on is that trademarks evolve, and you see there on your screen that Starbucks, their logo evolved, Ford, their logo is involved, and I'm guessing that's probably happened to one of your companies as well. The new marketing director may come in and say it's time for a change, or the business may feel it needs a fresh look, and that's fine. But just keep in mind that there's a strategic way to do these changes while preserving your registrations and rights in the original or older trademarks. And sophisticated companies will go through that process in iterative steps to make sure that they keep the continuity. And so just keep that in mind as well, that an abrupt change may significantly impact all the goodwill and rights that you've built up, and that there's a way to manage that. I believe, one thing I forgot to mention is, I'll save some time at the end for Q&A. And, if you have questions, please turn those in through Zoom, and we'll definitely, if we have time, take a look at those. And if we don't have time, I will try and address those after the fact if you've left your contact information, for example. Okay, so the next thing, copyright. And if you look at creative assets that your business generates, it's mostly copyright protected work or using copyright protected works from others. And so on your screen, you've got an overview there of what copyright law protects for those of you new to the concept. And it protects, literary works for sure, the text, the copy, but music and video and, art, architectural works, computer programs, all of that is protected by copyright. What it doesn't protect, would be the idea itself, common designs, facts, slogans, etc. And, it's a misnomer that you have to go get a registration. Copyright exists upon creation, in fact. But yes, getting a registration, especially for something that is prone to be knocked off or infringed by others, gets you many benefits and is a requirement in the US for you to file suit for copyright infringement. So keep that in mind as well. It's important to know that copyright is not just one right, it's a bundle of rights. And you got there on your screen the various rights involved. The most important of which, reproduce copies and prepare derivative works. And the second point means it gives you the right to vary or modify a copyright protected work. In terms of copyright protected works that your business creates itself, they're the original authors, they're putting out there. You have all of these rights, and that's great, and that's fine. The concern start appearing, and this is your focus when you're doing creative review, is what about copyright protected works that you've licensed or it's from a third party? You don't even know if it's licensed. What rights of these that you see on the screen do we have in those works? That should be the question that you would be asking yourself as you go through the creative review process. Can we actually modify and crop that image like my marketing person wants to do? What does the license say? Do we have a license? Those are all considerations that come in the copyright aspect of creative review. So, the default rule again is you own it, you create it, you own it. If your employee created it, you own it. You'll see sometimes in agreements that, hey, this is a work for hire. When a contractor is involved who's not an employee. Work for hire applies in limited situations. It's not what it sounds like by the title. I wish they gave it a different name. But it's a very sort of statute-based limited situation when work for hire applies. And so the safer approach as you're doing creative review is to always ask, if this is coming from outside the organization, not from an employee, do we have an assignment of IP rights, whether ownership assignment or do we have a license? Clearly in writing is what needs to be asked there. And so keep that in mind as you're doing creative review, because that's going to be something that rises very, very frequently. And so again, if there's ever third-party content in a project, the legal team will need to be involved to vet everything. So again, here's some watch outs, some do's and don'ts. Stock photo licenses, they can vary widely. And some appear to be stock photo licenses or, they appear to be free for all to use. But then there's the fine print. Commercial use is not allowed, or there are people featured in the copyrighted works like photos or video, and there's no publicity releases that attach to the license. So you have to be very careful and you have to review this holistically from all of those angles. And here's sort of a tricky one, right? You have to keep in mind that you may have taken a photo or you licensed a photo or took video, and you want to put it out there in this brand new TV commercial that's going to go on schedule because it's a big football game and you want this ad to go out. But in the background, there's a famous sculpture, or in the background, there's a famous piece of modern art. Well, each of those items have their own copyright protection, and the copyright owner would have a basis to bring a claim for copyright infringement against you if you publicly display the sculpture, that art, or anything of that nature without authorization. So look for the photo within the photo, look for the copyright within the copyright, and be mindful of this little nuance in copyright creative review. So if you look at this example, let's say you're a toy company. The boy there on the floor is playing with your toy. You want to put this out there in advertising on social media. It's going to be, a full page ad in a magazine. But if you look closer into that image, you'll see Uno is there, and there's Cat, and there's all these other games that are on there from competitors, from others. You don't have permission to display their brands. You don't have permission to display the copyright protected art that's on the game boards. And so again, you run the risk of a IP infringement cease and desist letter by using these types of materials without vetting them and thinking it through. Another example, so here, Manny Garcia took the photo on the left of President Obama, and then Shepard Fairey, of course, as you may recall, created the Hope poster based on that photo. Of course, a lawsuit followed, and Fairey claimed fair use, but a lawsuit followed, and it was later settled. But again, this is one of those situations where if you're the one creating that poster, you need to stop and ask yourself, do I have permission to create a derivative work here? Do I have some other basis to create this work, or am I going to get into trouble? Staying on politics, you have President Trump, who used Neil Young songs. He objected, he sued, the lawsuit was later dropped. But again, do you have permission when you're using third-party copyrighted works? That's something always to keep in mind. Moving on to some more areas of creative review, legal lines. You'll often see legal lines on creative materials, ads, print publications, and so on. And it's a good idea to include. It's not mandatory, but it is a good idea to include. There's a copyright legal line, which if you own the copyright in the works, then you can use that. And a trademark legal line, which puts people on notice of your trademarks or of third-party licensed trademarks. Sometimes the license will require you to state that you're using somebody's trademark under license through one of these legal lines. Again, not mandatory, but it puts people on notice about your copyright and trademark rights, which if down the road you need to enforce those rights, then this is a good factor and something that supports your case. So very good practice to include legal lines in your creative materials. Social media, this is just a normal part now. I used to say, hey, social media is new, keep it in mind. It's just normal marketing now. Everybody's doing it. The platforms, they keep changing as teenagers flee from Facebook to Instagram, from Instagram to TikTok. The marketing dollars chase them around. But one thing to keep in mind on social media is you're not an ordinary individual. You don't have the same First Amendment rights. You can't do the same type of things that individuals do. You're a business, you're a company, you're an organization, and different rules apply. It's commercial speech when you speak on social media. So think before you retweet that video or that image. Companies have been sued for using photographs that they didn't have permission to reproduce and redisplay out in social media. And there are companies and unfortunately lawyers that have a cottage industry of pursuing these types of infringements. Think about also right of publicity concerns. If you want to share a user's tweet and the photo, did you get a right of publicity waiver for everybody featured? Does it feature a celebrity? Even if not, individuals have some publicity rights as well. If there's text or content that you're sharing again, do you have permission from the author? Have you verified that this is the author's original content? Because it could be that they've just copied it from somebody else. And then also think about PR issues. Are you looking back at the history of this social user to see what else they're posting, what else they're saying? Because it's quite possible that they are saying things that go against, what your company stands for. And now you're setting yourself up for PR issues and those nightmares. So again, when it comes to social media, you need to be careful. If you have a big enough team, I would say the legal team should review the social content that's going out there. But if not, you should at least have standard operating protocols for your marketing team so they know the guidelines to stay within and then to reach out to you if they want to do something more than what you've allowed. Okay, FTC, FDA, all these three-letter acronyms, sometimes four. Big part of the creative review that we do. We're always thinking about these agencies and what they might look at in these creative assets that go out into the marketplace. And the goal of each of these entities is they want you to be truthful and not misleading, and they want you to adhere to the regulations that apply. And in some cases, USDA may apply, EPA may apply. There's all these other ones, but I'll focus on, FTC primarily here. It's about being truthful and not misleading in your advertising, your product packaging, what you're putting out there in social media and so on. And when you're out there making claims about your product, hey, it's 10 times faster than my competitor. I clean 10% better than I used to. All of these things. Substantiation is required. And reasonable substantiation is required. You can't just simply have the business, document some things here and there. They did their own tests. You want verifiable, repeatable third-party tests as a gold standard to be able to stand up your claims. And so as legal counsel for your business clients, that's something that you're always looking for is, can you back that up? If we're taken to court tomorrow, and trust me, FTC is, one agency looking at this, but what's more worrisome would be the class action plaintiffs bar or your competitors who are keeping a close eye on what you're putting out there, looking to see if you've messed up and they can take advantage. So you should be asking your business, can you stand up these claims? What do we have? And take a close look at what's going on. Now, the other thing is, if you're in a business that's trending, if you're out there promoting products related to COVID-19, CBD, hemp-derived goods, all natural, chocolate, whatever is trending, especially in the class action space, is where there should be greater scrutiny as well. So keep that in mind, and keep in mind what your industry is going through so that you know where to focus. Here you see on the screen, a couple examples. The first one is from early 2020. Whole leaf organics that you see there, the bottle, sold Thrive. It was a tablet consisting primarily of vitamin C and some herbal extracts. And then, suddenly when the pandemic started, their website started claiming that it has potent antiviral herbal extracts, strengthen your immunity against the pandemic, COVID-19, coronavirus. The FTC went after them, of course. Alleged that they made false and unsubstantiated claims. There were even some cancer treatment claims involved. They were subject to suit and an administrative proceeding. Once the pandemic started, the FTC sort of ramped up its scrutiny of claims in that area. And some of you, especially in the supplement space, may have seen this. And in December of 2020, so about a year ago, the FTC announced a crackdown with the catchy name of Operation CB Deceit. And in connection with CBD and the pandemic, they went after folks who were promoting both CBD products with COVID-19 related claims. Bionatral was one of those entities that got dinged, but there were many others as well. And lawsuits were filed, settlements were reached. But the key takeaway is, that the FTC, like you, is focused on what's trending. And they're putting greater and greater energy and resources into going after companies that are crossing the line. So keep that in mind. And keep in mind that the FTC is not just looking at your product. They're looking at the web. They're looking on social media, FDA as well. And they're going to make their allegation based on a combination of everything. So you might be okay on the website, but if on social media and on the product packaging, you're saying something else, you know, the fact that you directed people to your website, which is clean, is not going to save you. So keep that in mind as you go through sort of the regulatory aspects of creative review. Some of you may have dealt with, you know, celebrities and influencers in your line of work, or your marketing team may, without you knowing, be involving influencers to promote their products on social media. Keep in mind, you know, celebrities are not just the Kardashians or Dr. Fauci. You can have celebrities within niches, within fields. There's some, for example, in the healthcare space where we have clients where somebody is an influencer for a particular drug, and the drug company wants to see if they can leverage that following in some way. An influencer, for those of you who haven't dealt with them, you know, somebody who has a good following, typically on social media, where they influence the lifestyle and purchasing decisions of others. And typically they use authentic content to talk to their followers to keep them engaged, but sometimes they use sponsored content, or they put out content that, at least behind the scenes, is being sponsored by somebody else. And that's where it becomes very important for the brand, for you to follow the regulations that apply. You know, FTC has put out guidelines, you can see those on the screen there, with regard to endorsements and testimonials and advertising. And so if you have an influencer or celebrity out there touting your product, there are certain things that they are going to have to follow, and that you will be held responsible for them following. And one of the most important things is they have to represent an accurate experience and opinion. They can't put out something that you drafted, that you wrote up, when they had no such experience. Are they taking the product? Are they using your service? Are they actually happy with it? Did they get those benefits that are written on your product? Packaging. All of those things are very important. And the second most important thing is, if there's any quid pro quo, free product, payment, a vacation, all of those things, it needs to be disclosed clearly and conspicuously, not buried in some hashtag list, not left on some profile page where the consumer has to dig, but whether it's social media, radio, TV, blogs, it needs to be upfront and it needs to be disclosed. And while the FTC is going after some celebrities and influencers, it's usually the brand. It's you that's going to be held responsible. And so a lot of the larger brands and companies who use influencers, who use celebrities, will have monitoring programs to actually make sure that these folks are following their rules, their guidelines, their manual. And when they're not, they have to go out and bring them in line. So if you look at a couple examples here on the screen that you can see, both of these are on social media. The first one is a micro-influencer with about 17,000 followers, promoting hemp seed oil capsules in this post. But there's no disclosures at all that the product was provided for free or any payment was provided. This, if this was your brand, your company, this would be problematic. And if the FTC got wind of it, or a competitor, you could be in some trouble. If you look at the second example, on the other screen, you've got another influencer. Here we have a COVID-19 mask sponsored by Coca-Cola. But here we have the brand Coca-Cola actually following the guidance by FTC. And so you see with the little arrow there that the influencer has made it clear that this is an ad. And so the followers know that this is not just, a Coca-Cola fan. Naturally, that, there's some quid pro quo involved here. And that's fine. And, I think fans and followers are used to that. And the great thing is it looks like, this endorsement is actually working. A couple comments down, you see somebody saying, hey, it makes me thirsty for a Coca-Cola. So, influencers work. You just got to follow the rules. As we, move on from there, a few more things to kind of focus on. One is, sweepstakes, contests, and promotion laws. A lot of companies do sweepstakes and contests. They do it through social media, they do it on their website, they do it through email campaigns. Often unwittingly, they don't realize that there are actually, patchwork of federal and state laws and regulations that apply. In some cases, you might have to register the contest. It depends, where you are and what you're trying to do. And so keep an eye out for that. If your company is looking to promote a sweepstakes or contest, you'll need careful legal review to make sure there's a disclosure of the rules and that any other legal issues are complied with. Another thing that we see often, especially these days, with creative pieces, are made in USA claims. A lot of companies make it. It's all over Amazon, and the fraud is pretty rampant. The FTC actually recently issued a new rule with monetary penalties to go after the abuse. But to use the Made in USA claim without qualification, it's going to be pretty tough. And if you're going to make that unqualified claim, you're going to have to be able to show that all or virtually all of your product is made in the United States. And if you can't, there's other ways to express things like assembled in the United States, or whether, most of the components are from the United States. But it's sort of a nuanced analysis and things that you really want to carefully think about. And so as new creative materials come in, or as you look through older materials, product packaging for your company, if you notice a Made in USA claim, you're going to want to go through and see if we can actually back that up, especially under the new rule and the existing regulations. So watch out for Made in USA. And the other sort of FTC focus for a while now would be going after greenwashing. And greenwashing would mean and would involve where you're going out and raising claims, making claims, and putting out advertising about sustainability or eco-friendly, things like that. Again, without qualification, that will get you into trouble with FTC, potentially with competitors, potentially class action plaintiffs bar. So again, you want to be careful about what you put out there in terms of environmental benefits. And again, there is a guide, the green guides for short, but the FTC has put out a guide. And all of these guides, by the way, I mean, it's not binding law. These are guidelines, these are guidances. They're actually written for business people, not lawyers, so they make sense. They have a lot of examples of what you can and can't do. And so it would be a good idea to share these with your business team, with your marketing team, if they are in this space. FTC does plan to review the guides in 2022, again, because deceptive environmental claims are on the rise. But if you have existing materials out there already talking about eco-friendly benefits and things of that nature, it would be a very good idea to reference the guides and see if you need to make adjustments to any of the creative materials you're putting out there. So I wanted to leave, about 10, 15 minutes, again, Friday afternoon at 4. I know where I stand in your weekend plans. So we'll finish a little early, but I did want to leave some time for Q&A. And my understanding is that, if you have a question, you can put it in through the Q&A feature of the Zoom platform. And then I can look through those. If you want to put it in the chat, I can look through that as well. So let's see, we have one question where it talks about medication commercials frequently use its trademarks as nouns in the ads and dialogue. Does this practice harm the marks? It's very frequent. Sometimes you can see the generic name of the drug in writing, which we've seen sort of italicized off to the left or something like that. So that's a great question. And it's not just drugs, right? You will often hear, grab a Coca-Cola in Coca-Cola advertising, or do this or do that, or come visit us at this place, where the place name is a trademark. And at times it's not avoidable. At times, if you have to put a generic term after every brand, your marketing is going to sound clunky. But that should be the exception rather than the norm. And where you particularly want to be careful is, for example, your printed materials. If you can follow the practice, it'd be great there. And you also want to be careful when you're putting out video materials as well that may stay on for a period of time on the web or as a web asset. But most importantly, I feel that you need to keep this in mind is when your trademark is one that is unique and might become generic for the thing itself. So we talked about, for example, Frisbee. Think about Crock-Pot, right? Crock-Pot used to be a brand, I guess still is a brand, but people now just refer to slow cookers as my Crock-Pot. If you are coming out with something that's new, that's unique, that's novel, that doesn't really have a lot of competition, and you're new to the market, that is when you want to be extremely careful about consistently following the term with a generic word or generic phrase, so that consumers don't over time simply equate your brand with the thing itself and make it generic, and then your trademark dies a slow death. So that's something we want to avoid, but a good question. We have another question about whether there are any unique considerations for ads that reference cryptocurrencies. So, in terms of cryptocurrencies, we have Bitcoin, which, Bitcoin as sort of the original crypto out there, you would think would be in this similar situation where over time, everybody would refer to crypto as Bitcoin. But surprisingly, now we have a variety of cryptocurrencies and, different ones, Dogecoin, and different ones are taking off. But folks, at least, for the crypto marketplace or those who invest in it, understand that it's the name of a different crypto, and that the underlying thing is different from the brand itself. I think, just speaking off the top of my head, what is interesting is how these names, Bitcoin, Dogecoin, Handshake, and all these other ones, how they are truly things like the dollar or the rupee or the euro and things like that in a certain sense. And so over time, are these going to be brands? Are they going to be the name for a certain type of legal tender? I don't know. It's an interesting future ahead of us, and it'll be fun to see as that market and the regulatory environment continues to develop. So, great question. If there are any other questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A. If not, my contact information is on the screen. If you feel that the question is something you'd rather ask privately, feel free to reach out. I love brainstorming about things like this. This is a subject near and dear to my heart, but enjoyed giving this presentation. thank you so much for attending. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Anuj. I appreciate it. Great presentation. Very practical advice. So with that, we've come to the end. I want to thank everyone for sticking through the whole 3 days. It's been a long but a great CLE. Want to thank all of our great speakers and presenters. Again, great topics, great speakers, great engagement. I know Lynette and I would also like to thank Elaine here at the State Bar, who's done an amazing job of keeping the trains moving on time and getting the Zoom and the share screen feature to work, as well as Holly Starr from Chick-fil-A, who has been a great help to both of us of interfacing with the speakers and Lane at the State Bar to get everything set for this seminar. So with that, we are adjourned, and I would like to tell everyone to have a great weekend. Thank you.
This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for joining. Have a great afternoon.